Chapter 10, Gone. Warning, this chapter is violent. Skim the violent areas and skip to the next paragraph for plot if you do not wish to read them. This warning will only appear in applicable chapters. Ruby woke up to the sound of knocks on the front door, Alice arms around her chest. The moonlight shone through the window, illuminating glittering snowflakes that swirled to the ground. Gently disentangling herself, she rolled off the bed, groping around for the first thing she found and pulling it on. Dressed in a thin white nightgown, she walked to the door, running her hands through her hair and trying to make herself presentable. Turning the knob, she opened the door and found herself staring into the barrel of an automatic shotgun, glowing blue with aura. Hello. The sound of gunfire jolted Alice awake. Wrapping a robe around herself, she ran into the front hall, arriving just in time to see Ruby flying back and smashing into the opposite wall. Enough, Ruby growled. Bending her knees and bracing herself against the wall, she launched herself towards the man holding the shotgun. Sheriff Simon. Alice gasped. The sheriff grunted an affirmative as he raised the shotgun to block Ruby's fist. There was a shriek of abused metal as Ruby's fist plowed through the shotgun and sent the halves flying across the room. Grabbing hold of the sheriff's shoulders, she picked him up and slammed him into the ground, forcing a grunt through his lungs and causing his aura to fizzle out and fade. Preparing to smash him again and break his spine, Ruby lifted him off the floor, only to be stopped by a small pair of hands grabbing at her nightgown. Red, stop. This is the sheriff, there must have been some sort of misunderstanding, stop. Complying with her request, Ruby merely held him in her hands, dangling 3 feet off the floor. Misunderstanding. The sheriff snorted. This young lady here is Ruby Rose, one of the most wanted murderers in Vale. I'm actually surprised that you're still alive, Miss Alice. The sheriff hit the ground with an oof as Ruby dropped him, backing away from Alice and clutching her arms in anguish. She felt her world beginning to crumble. What do you mean? That's RWBY, who's this Ruby you're talking about? The sheriff propped himself up on his elbows and looked directly at Ruby. I received reports from some of your coworkers that someone with black and red hair who matched the description of Ruby Rose picked you up after work yesterday. I alerted the authorities and then came here to check on you, hoping I wasn't too late. Her teeth bared in a rictus of anger, Ruby advanced upon Manny on the ground, fists clenched and shoulders hunched. You. I had a life, I had a love, I had a heart, and you just ruined it all. She screamed. Why? Sheriff Simon looked a little confused, trying to comprehend what Ruby was ranting about. Alice's face was pale and still. Red, no, Ruby, is this true? Ruby looked up from the sheriff and slowly nodded. Yes, but I'm changed now. Please don't run from me, Alice. Alice's hands were at her mouth, tears forming in the corners of her eyes as she shook her head in disbelief. The sheriff coughed. You'd better give yourself up, Ruby. Even if you kill me, there are still more people on the way. Ruby walked over and slammed his head into the ground to get him to shut up. Ruby started moving slowly towards Alice, arms open. Alice, I love you, still love you, and I will always love you. You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen, in mind and soul. Please. Alice looked at her, her frightened eyes shining with tears. Ruby's heart clenched as she saw Alice's hesitation. Her back stiffening, Ruby turned around and began walking towards the closet to grab her weapon. Her hands shook and her vision was getting blurry. And suddenly, she felt a pair of arms wrap around her waist. Heart stuttering, she turned around and pulled Alice up, giving her a passionate kiss. I love you too, Ruby, Alice gasped, tears flowing freely now. I don't care who you are or what you are, I will always love you. Ruby kissed her again, the taste of Alice mingling with the taste of their tears as she pressed against her. Come out with your hands up, weapons down. We have orders to shoot on sight. I repeat, come out with your hands up, weapons down. No, Alice whispered, clutching Ruby tightly. Don't go. Ruby took hold of her hands, looking straight into her face. Tell them you knew nothing about me being a murderer. Tell them you had nothing to do with me, that I was just hiding here. Gripping Alice's hands tighter, she continued. I'll come back for you one day, promise me that you'll wait for me. No matter what, I'll come back for you. Alice nodded and buried her head in Ruby's chest. I promise. Come out now. If you do not come out, we are prepared to destroy the house. You have 30 seconds. The sounds of concussion cannons being primed pierced the night. Extricating herself from Alice's grip, Ruby gave her one last tender kiss. Alice, I won't be going down without a fight, Ruby comforted her. Alice let out a small laugh and sniffled. You're supposed to say that you'll get away safe and sound, and that you'll come back as soon as possible for me, she said with a sad smile. Ruby grimly smiled back and pulled her weapon out of the closet. As Ruby unfolded her side, the last of Alice's doubts fell away. The moonlight cast Ruby's pale features in a glow, lending her nightgown an ethereal form, contrasting with the brutal red and black side that she now held in her hands. She loved Ruby, despite her past and her flaws. 10. Ruby walked to the entrance and looked back. 9. Unable to resist, Alice gave her one last parting kiss, full of love and warmth. 8. Don't let them catch you, run if you can. Live Ruby. 7. Ruby nodded. I'll return. Young, Blake, and Weiss stood with the troops outside the house. After finding out that Beacon was sending experimental AK-210 androids to help capture Ruby, they had requested to go along with the troops. They still felt guilty after finding out that Ruby had committed murder right under their noses without the three noticing anything, and they suspected that their help would probably be needed in order to subdue Ruby. Predicting that Ruby would try to run, Weiss had gone ahead and set up 5 layers of glyphs in a circle around the house. The voice over the loudspeaker droned on. 6, 5, 4. A figure in white appeared in the doorway of the house. Dressed in a thin nightgown and nothing else, the snow softly rustled under her bare feet as she walked towards the ring of robots surrounding the house. Here she comes, Young muttered, watching Ruby as she came closer. Weiss, activate your barrier glyphs. With a nearly inaudible hum, a sphere of aura sprung up around them, trapping themselves inside the area with Ruby and the androids. Ruby found herself face to face with a glowing white barrier after dashing above and past the crowd of robots in a shower of rose petals. Slashing at the barrier, she ripped it open, only to find another layer behind it. The first stun grenade exploded in front of her just as she turned around, her vision temporarily blinded and her head aching. Shaking herself, she dashed into the midst of the robots, waiting just long enough for them to fire their arm-mounted concussion cannons before dashing back out, sowing chaos as the robots fired at themselves. Pockets of robots exploded as Ruby dashed in and out, slicing and dicing and destroying swaths of the androids. Seeing the number of the robots dwindle, Blake unsheathed her weapon and began swinging the sickle, preparing to do battle. Young tried to make one last attempt while Weiss silently watched. Picking up a loudspeaker, Young pleaded with Ruby. Ruby, please turn yourself in. We don't want to hurt you. I want to hurt her, Blake muttered. Ruby had been hit with a few more stun grenades and more than a few concussion cannons as she began to tire, her aura flickering. As strong as she was, the horde of robots was overwhelming, especially because they had no sense of self-preservation. However, the crowd had begun to thin as she continued fighting, giving her a fleeting sense of hope that was dashed when she heard Yang's voice. She knew then that fleeing was impossible if her 3 previous teammates were present. Her arms tiring, her strength flagged as she struggled against the last few robots. Her side flew out of her fingers as she caught a concussion blast in her back, knocking her to the ground. A scream came from the cottage as Alice flew out of the door, her rifle in her hands and firing wildly at the robots that were closing in on Ruby. Ruby could only watch helplessly as a robot near her turned and fired twice at the new threat. Unlike with Ruby, the robot had no orders to subdue and used explosive dust weapons instead of the concussion cannons. 2 holes appeared in Alice's chest, stopping her short and making her drop her weapon. Blood poured down the front of her robe as she clutched her chest and fell onto her knees, then collapsed face down in the snow. Ruby let out a wail of grief and misery as she watched her hopes and dreams bleed into the ground. Her loss driving her, she picked up her scythe from the ground beside her and swung it furiously, effortlessly shearing the robot in half. Full of anger, Ruby stood again, fighting with renewed strength. Eyes filled with tears, she didn't notice the blur of Blake's sickle in the corner of her vision until it was too late. The blade sinking into her left arm, Ruby's scythe fell out of her limp fingers. Without hesitation, Ruby caught the scythe with right hand and continued swinging, clearing the last few robots around her. Then she swung her scythe at Blake's sickle, attempting to cut the ribbon it was attached to. Blake anticipated Ruby's move and jerked the sickle out of Ruby's arm, then flung it out again, firing the gun and wrapping the ribbon around Ruby. Ruby shifted her body and managed to only get her waist tangled, then faltered when the sickle swung around and stabbed directly into her stomach. Ruby felt the blade shift around inside her as she flew towards Blake, her adrenaline rush blocking her sense of pain and allowing her to ignore the blade embedded in her middle. Blake's eyes widened as Ruby threw her side towards her and then gripped the ribbon and pulled herself after it. The red and black weapon spun in a deadly arc, heading towards Blake. With an explosion of fire and light, Yang activated her aura and deflected the side with her gauntlets. The side spun into the air and thudded into the ground next to Blake. Ruby was suddenly next to Yang, one arm drawn back as she prepared to plunge her hand into Yang's body. With a glow of white, Weiss air stepped in front of Yang and thrust Murdenaster into Ruby's chest, spinning the dust vials and sending out a line of ice to smash into Ruby and knock her away. Blake's sickle ripped out of her stomach with a sickening slurp. Weiss gasped and fell to her knees, the Herculean task of keeping up the 5-layered barrier while using her glyphs and dust pushing her to exhaustion. Ruby struggled to stay standing, one arm useless by her side and the other hand struggling to keep her insides where they belonged. A large chunk of ice was speared through her sternum. Ruby narrowed her eyes, concentrating. With an unexpected swirl of petals, Ruby disappeared and reappeared next to Blake, ripping the side out of the ground and swinging it at Weiss, who had her back exposed as she knelt on the ground and tried to regain her strength. Blake spun and pressed her weapon into Ruby's throat area, firing it at point-blank range just as Yang shot Ruby's leg, smashing through her thigh bone. Ruby crumpled, unable to complete her side swing as she collapsed onto the ground. Blake had shattered her collarbone, the sharp fragments piercing her skin as she convulsed, her mouth in an O shape as she soundlessly screamed. Blood poured from the entry and exit wounds on her thigh, a sure sign that her femoral artery had been ripped open. Yang screamed at Weiss to take down her barrier as she took out a communication device and called for the hoverjet. Ruby faintly heard the gust of the propellers as she bled out. A needle pierced her arm, and Ruby felt her searing pain dull down into muted thumping. Her body, however, was not fooled as she felt her muscles continue to convulse and writhe, threatening to snap her bones. She was beginning to feel cold, and had lost all feeling in her extremities. Ruby was a complete mess. All that remained of the white nightgown were a couple of ribbons ringing her chest and arms, the white cloth now soaked with dark red blood. Her belly was split open and her internal organs were clearly visible, the gleaming viscera reflecting the lights on the inside of the hoverjet. Blood pumped out of her throat and thigh wound, and her left arm was sliced to the bone, the pale white peeking through her skin and muscle. The slowly melting shard of ice was lodged in her chest, sealing the hole it had created and letting only a trickle of blood leak between her breasts. Yang stood over Ruby, shouting for her to stay awake, to stay alive. Doctors swarmed her as they began sewing, plugging, and healing her wounds, some of them holding hands glowing with aura over her more serious injuries. The tide of blood refused to be stemmed, however, as each beat of Ruby's heart pulsed out a fresh spray of fluid. Ruby opened her mouth and Yang leaned towards her, tilting her head to the side. "I had finally found love," Ruby whispered, struggling to stay conscious. "But then you killed her. Why did you kill her? She was innocent and pure and good. I loved her. Her lungs failed her as the last whisper of air escaped them." Upon hearing Ruby, Weiss had gasped and ran off towards the cottage, where the doe faunus body lay. Yang was screaming that Ruby had stopped breathing. Ruby closed her eyes, a calm settling over her, a shroud of darkness stealing upon her mind. Big eyes, soft lips, frail body, strong soul. She healed Ruby, healthy and whole. Her love and hope to whom she spilled. The ache in her heart completely fulfilled. Did you really think she would still murder, torture, and kill? Chapter 11, Confrontation. Save her, save her. I'm trying. She's lost too much blood. No, no, no. Ruby, wake up. Wake up. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. Blake, I killed her. I killed my own sister. Oh God, no. She was a murderer. You saved Weiss's life. You had no choice. I shot her, she was bleeding everywhere. Why did I shoot her, Blake, why? You had no choice, she was crazed. Her aura was low, young, anything would have damaged her. Doctor, save her, please, I beg you. At this point, Ms. Xiaolong, any further action would merely be desecrating a corpse. Mrs. Belladonna, if you would please remove her from the premises. Yang, stop, she's dead. Shish, stop crying. There was no pain. Her eyes were open, but they were dry and one of them couldn't focus on anything. Slowly blinking, the sense of human and faunus and disinfectant around her, Ruby tried to figure out what was going on. She had no idea how long it had been since she'd heard a spoken word. She rolled her eyeballs and found that one of them was deflated. Craning her neck to look down at her body, her vision slowly returned as she felt her drained eye refill with vitreous fluid. A Y-shaped incision had been cut into her chest, her skin lifted up and peeled to the sides. The entire front of her rib cage had been removed, exposing her ragged lungs and heart. Even as she watched, the perforations in her lungs sealed and her damaged heart began to close up. Her heart began to move again, pulsing gently. Listening closely, she heard the voices of the pathologists and nurses discussing the extent of her injuries in another room. An autopsy, she realized. I'm in the middle of an autopsy. A squeaking sound came from the hallway. Ruby stilled her eyes in her face, but her traitorous heart kept beating as a nurse wheeled a trolley into the room. Catching a glimpse of movement, the human nurse frowned and moved closer to investigate. Her jaw dropped. What the? Her other arm useless, Ruby propelled herself up with just her right arm and was still able to latch onto the soft underside of the nurse's throat despite her lack of attached chest muscles. Working her jaw, she bit down and severed her vocal cord, then let herself fall back, ripping the nurse's throat out. The nurse spasmed and clutched her neck, arterial blood spurting. In a matter of seconds, she had fainted and fell onto Ruby, the blood continuing to splash out and onto Ruby's face. The smell of blood aroused her appetites, making her leaking stomach growl with hunger. Chewing and swallowing the piece of neck meat, she tilted her face up and directed the spray of blood into her mouth, drinking until the flow lessened. Ripping off another chunk of flesh, she swallowed greedily. She was voracious, feeling as if she had not eaten in years, and she savored each bite of flesh. The meat seemed to disappear even before it got down to her stomach. Her left arm healed first, allowing her to tear off chunks of flesh even faster and cram her mouth, eating with wild abandon. A scream came from the doorway, and Ruby realized that the medical personnel had come back. Shoving the body off of her, she managed to get a glimpse of the pathologist fleeing the room, screaming for help. She tried to get off the examination table and stand up, but she realized too late that her abdominal muscles had been cut away, and she fell to the floor, coils of intestines spilling out. She tried to shovel the intestines back in, feeling curiously numb as she felt only the sensation of her hands and no pain. The ropes of flesh were slippery and ragged, some sections breaking off faster than Ruby could place them back into her body. Giving up, she dragged herself to the wall, propping herself up and trying to will herself to heal faster. Unfortunately, Ruby realized that a set of ribs and an entire layer of skin and muscle didn't heal very quickly. She sighed and shifted herself into a more comfortable position, resigning herself to waiting. A few minutes later, Glinda Goodwitch burst into the room. Ruby looked up and made eye contact with her, stopping her in her tracks as she looked at Ruby in shock and confusion. Recovering quickly, she drew 4 glyphs, 2 binding Ruby's arms behind her and 2 binding her legs to each other. Without her hand keeping them in, Ruby's insides started to spill out again. Glinda paused, wondering what to do. Taking out a roll of steel silk, she began wrapping Ruby in the silvery gray strips, trying the best she could to push her organs back in while also trying not to touch them. Ruby forcibly suppressed a smile as she tried not to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. A string of intestines was still hanging out between the wraps of steel silk, as Glinda waved her wand and moved Ruby onto the trolley. Rolling Ruby out of the room, she left the nurse's savaged body for someone else to clean up. She's alive. Jack Everest, head of the Department of State Affairs, had been a semi-permanent resident at Beacon during the search for Ruby. He was preparing to leave after finalizing Ruby's death certificates and taking down the warrant for her arrest. Now, he stared at the pale body that was surrounded with glyphs and strapped onto a trolley, being wheeled to the confinement chambers. She doesn't look alive to me, he said skeptically. Glendale Goodwitch, psychiatric examiner and brother of Glinda Goodwitch, spoke from next to him. Trust me, she's perfectly alive, just look at the body in the autopsy room if you want proof. She managed to eat part of the poor nurse before another someone found her and called for help. Everest frowned. Can we question her now? She might not be able to answer, considering that her diaphragm was cut open during the autopsy, but if we can get someone to sew her back up, I don't see why not. Everest grimaced. Alright, get a surgeon and let's go. Ruby was strapped to the wall in the confinement chamber, the entrance shrouded in a thick layer of glyphs. Her limbs were strapped to the hooks on the walls with a couple of layers of steel silk. The barrier to the confinement chamber suddenly went down, allowing the sound of voices to travel into the chamber. Sir, I haven't done anything like this before. Yes, just sew her back up, nothing to it. We need her to be able to talk, and that ruptured diaphragm isn't helping. A nervous man carrying a toolbox walked in, followed by Professor Ospin, Everest, and Glendale. The small room was suddenly crowded, the three of them cramped into a corner to give the surgeon space. He set down the toolbox, straightened his coat, and introduced himself. Hello, he began carefully, I'm Thomas, and I'm going to reseal your chest and stomach area so you'll be able to talk. Ruby felt a little sorry for him, so she gave him a smile and nodded. The fact that her face was smeared with blood and her expression looked more like a grimace didn't seem to deter the man, who gave her back a grateful smile as he pulled out a needle and steel silk thread from the toolbox. As he worked on her, Ruby felt only a slight tugging sensation as the needle passed in and out of her skin, pulling the flaps of fat and muscle on the sides of her torso back together. I can't do anything about your ribs, and you might still be a bit leaky, but I think you'll be able to talk at least, Thomas proclaimed as he finished. Ruby pulled in a weak breath. Thank you, she exhaled softly. Thomas nodded and walked out of the room. Professor Ospin stepped forward, preparing to introduce the two next to him, when he heard shouting coming down the hallway. You may not see her. She's being questioned and you cannot interrupt them. Like hell I can't. Ruby's my sister. Glendale looked at Ospin. Perhaps her friends can get her to talk before we start asking questions. Ospin nodded. I agree. Shouting, he said, let them in. They are allowed to enter. Yang appeared in the doorway, followed by Weiss, who looked guilty and distressed, and Blake, who had a blank expression on her face. Yang paused, not knowing what to say. You're alive, she began. I thought you died. I thought I killed you, sis. Ruby's face had frozen as she recalled what had occurred before she died. I did die, and you did kill me. You killed me, and you took away my love. I don't really want to speak to you guys right now. Yang looked crestfallen, stepping back with tears brimming in her eyes. Seeing Yang's expression, Blake bared her teeth, but even her attempt looked half-hearted as she saw Ruby's freshly heartbroken expression. Ruby, was the person you lived with called Allison? Weiss asked, a mournful expression on her face as if she knew what the answer would be. Ruby's barest hopes were dashed at the mention of Alice's name in the past tense. She nodded slowly, unable to speak, waiting for Weiss's response. I had a sort of crush on her. I know you're probably not listening to me, but I saw her on a trip to town when I went to buy dust. The next time I went to the store, I saw her with someone. Was that you? Ruby closed her eyes and gave the tiniest of nods, tears beginning to trickle down her face. Weiss had started crying, too. When you asked me earlier if I had anyone I liked, I was thinking about her, she said in a trembling voice. She paused, trying to regain her composure but failing, her face crumpling. I'm so sorry, Ruby, she cried, her tears dripping down her face as her sobbing intensified. I'm so sorry. I loved her too, I didn't ever want her to be hurt either. Ruby, believe me, Weiss choked up, unable to go on. Blake had been holding Yang, comforting her, and she now pulled Weiss into her embrace, too. Her arms over both of their shoulders, she turned and walked out of the room, never looking back at Ruby. The three had been watching the spectacle quietly. Glendale now walked forward, hands glowing with aura, and traced 3 glyphs around Ruby's head. A few seconds later, he jerked back, rubbing his palms as if he had been burned. Ruby felt his intrusion into her mind and looked up. I was so lonely, no one would be with me, so I made them part of me forever. She whispered. I'm changed, I found love, but now I'm alone again. Ruby gave a sad little smile and looked back down. The room was silent. Everest was the first to speak. I've seen enough. Gesturing for Ozpin and Glendale to follow him, Everest left the confinement chamber and walked down the hallway and into a conference room. Ushering them in, he glanced back and closed the door behind him. Chapter 12 sent. Everest, Ozpin, and Glendale pulled out chairs and sat down at the table. How did your examination go, Glendale? What's she like? Everest asked. Glendale looked worried, tapping the tips of his fingers together. The glyphs I drew form a sort of connection between me and the recipient, he explained. Usually this lets me get a good reading on people about their hopes, desires, emotions, and things of that sort. I can't get concrete thoughts, but I can get a general sense of what their emotional state is like. He hesitated. Spit it out, Glendale, Everest ordered. Ruby's mind. It felt similar to someone who had experienced severe trauma. I couldn't get any sort of coherent reading from her. For all intents and purposes, her mind is completely broken, thrown into chaos, reduced to her basest instincts. The only two recognizable emotions I felt were longing and hunger. He shivered, troubled by his look into her psyche. This is unprecedented, Ozpin murmured to himself in worried tones. What are we going to do with you, Ruby? Everest heard him and his jaw tightened. She demonstrates sociopathic traits and is unfit for society. She is clearly unable to stand for trial due to her mental health issues. Instead, she will be used as a rogue huntress. Ozpin's jaw dropped a little as he considered what Everest was saying. That seems a little harsh, for God's sake, she's only 15. And we're not even going to give her a fair trial. She's battle ready, she's strong, and she cannot be around people. We should put her into training immediately and send her out. If she dies fighting Grimm, then our problems will be solved. Can't we train her as a soldier? Maybe we could conscript her into the army. We can't just send Ruby to certain death. Stop thinking of her as an innocent girl, Professor. She's a murderer, and we cannot allow her near a fresh recruit nor an upstanding soldier. Glendale interjected. As a mental health professional, I would like to say that I doubt we can control her. She has no one to live for, her friends have abandoned her, and no sponsors want her. Her actions are simply too wild and too violent. Barring execution, the only thing we can do is send her into isolation. Everest is correct, she's too dangerous to keep at my facility or any facility for that matter, due to the chance that she could escape and wreak havoc. My conviction has only been bolstered after seeing her come back to life. If she escapes, I doubt we will be able to take her down again, especially considering her monstrous healing capabilities. It's decided then. As head of the Department of State Affairs, I sentence her to indefinite confinement to the northern region of the Dragon Wings. She will work to destroy Grimm and scout out areas for human habitation. She will be sent to the rogue camp to begin her training tomorrow. Ozpin's face turned pale as he realized that the decision had just been made. She's 15, you can't just take away her life. The rogue camp is filled with filthy murderers and rapists, and you're just going to give them a young girl to play with and abuse. Don't let your personal life affect this decision. Shut up, Everest roared. His face was red and his chest was heaving. My son, my beautiful son, was killed by this whore. She sexually assaulted all of her victims, she assaulted my son. We don't even know how many people she might have killed in her past. If anything, she would fit in perfectly with those criminals at Rogue Camp. Ozpin fell silent as he considered this information. Everest had adopted a Faunus child a few years back, but Ozpin hadn't made the connection between one of Ruby's victims and Everest. He now saw why he was pushing for such a harsh sentencing. As a minor, Ruby wasn't eligible for the death sentence, but she could still be sent to government camps outside of court jurisdiction. Glendale, could you please leave us for a second? Ozpin asked. Glendale looked confused, but he nodded and walked into the coffee room, closing the door behind him. Everest, Ozpin began in a quiet voice, I know about your assassin cells. Everest froze as he turned and stared back at Ozpin. What are you talking about? Don't think I haven't noticed those random deaths and accidents, Everest. I know you are the head of the Secret Operations Division. I know that the squad under your control killed some of the highest-ranked leaders of White Fang along with outspoken political dissenters. Don't deny this, I'm not going to blackmail you. Then what do you want? I want you to consider the fact that your covert operatives were the ones who killed Ruby's parents. Everest's eyes widened. At that moment, the room was so silent that the sound of fresh coffee being made was clearly audible from behind the door of the coffee room. How? What's worse is that all of your operatives wear white fang masks, meaning that Ruby has assumed that the Faunus are responsible for everything bad that has ever happened to her, including the events that occurred afterwards, such as the death of her sister. I'm surprised that she didn't just outright murder the Doe Faunus she had been hiding with. However, the main point is this: because of your actions, you are directly culpable for the person Ruby has become today. Her sister. Yes, I know you had no hand in her death. That's not my point. Like I said, I'm not going to blackmail you. However, I'd like you to think about bringing Ruby onto your team. Everest choked a little and cleared his throat. What? You want me to bring my son's murderer and a psychopath into my team? I just want you to consider it, is all. You can grant her immunity or falsify her death if she joins your team. Delay Ruby's sentencing and take a few days to think about it. Everest stared down at the table, silent. Karma's a bitch, huh? He muttered to himself. A minute of silence stretched into 5 minutes as the two men sat there and thought. 10 minutes later, Everest straightened and stood up. I'm not making any promises, but I will delay Ruby's sentencing for 2 days. That's all I'm asking for, Everest. Everest called Glendale out of the coffee room. I want you to keep everything you heard today confidential, do you understand? Glendale nodded. I said, do you understand? Glendale muttered his assent and nodded even faster. Everest grunted and headed for the exit. As Everest left the room, he was so lost in his thoughts that didn't notice the soft displacement of air that blew out from behind the door. Blake, Weiss, and Young raced down the hallway after spying on the meeting between the three. She had a sister. How come she never told me? And what's this about her parents being assassinated? Young wondered. Blake shrugged, lost in her own thoughts. Was this why her victims were all Faunus? She gave herself a mental shake, focusing on the task at hand. So, why are we trying to break her out again? Yang's face tightened, her resolve showing plainly. I wasn't able to save her the first time. I should have taken better care of her, I should have asked her what was wrong, but I ignored her and now I'm paying the price. She somehow came back to life, so I have another chance at redemption. I'm not going to let my sister be sent to RWBY camp to die, no matter what she has done. Do you think she really loved Alice? Is that why she didn't kill her? Blake asked. Yes, Weiss answered. I looked over the police reports after we fought her. People had seen Alice leaving her workplace with a stranger, but they just assumed that Alice was living with a relative or was in a relationship. It wasn't until weeks later that Ruby slipped up and took off her coat to give to Alice because she was cold. One of Alice's co-workers instantly recognized her and reported her to the sheriff. Weiss paused, choosing her words carefully. Ruby had been living with Alice for weeks, and in the end Alice was shot trying to defend Ruby. I think they truly loved each other. Blake nodded. That's all I needed to know. A few minutes later, they had circled the building and arrived at the confinement chambers from the other hallway, avoiding Everest, Ozpin, and Glendale. The barrier in the entrance of Ruby's cell was strong, but Weiss merely stuck her sword into it and began channeling aura. The barrier flickered and went out. Hurry, she gasped. I didn't take down the base glyphs, so this barrier is going to reactivate itself in a few minutes even if I continue suppressing it with my aura. Stepping into the cell, Blake and Yang approached the sleeping Ruby, suspended 2 feet above the ground. Yang felt her anger grow as she looked upon Ruby's naked, thin body, covered in stitches and scars and bullet holes, her chest oddly sunken as the majority of her rib cage still hadn't grown back yet. Gently stroking Ruby's hair, Yang whispered, "Wake up, Ruby." Ruby's eyes snapped open, seeing Blake and Yang standing in front of her. I don't forgive you and I probably never will, Blake began. But based on our past friendship and your relationship with Alice, Yang believes that you have changed. I don't know whether you have or not, but even I think that RWBY camp is too harsh. I love you, sis, Yang said. And although I failed to protect you the first time, I'll definitely protect you this time. For Alice, Weiss simply said. Ruby was silent, watching them. Blake stepped forward, unsheathing her katana and slicing at Ruby's steel silk bonds. The moment the sword was about to collide with the steel silk strips, a purple bubble expanded outwards and encased the three, freezing them in midair when they tried to dash away. Linda had activated the glyphs in Ruby's confinement chamber, igniting the fail-safes designed for attempted breakouts. I realize you used to be friends, but that is no excuse for freeing a murderer, Glinda scolded. I'll let you off this once, but make no mistake, if I thought you three were wiser and knew exactly what you were doing, you'd all be sitting in a cell right next to Ruby. Glinda sighed and ran a hand through her hair. Oh, the foolishness of youth. She had been in a similar situation herself when she was younger, but her punishment had not been so lenient. Do you have anything else to say to her? I've soundproofed the room. I'll give you a chance to say anything you want, as long as you promise not to attempt this foolish endeavor again. I'm upping the barrier strength and setting the glyphs to incinerate anyone who tries to tamper with them. This will probably be the last time you'll see her, so make it count. Ruby, listen to me, Young pleaded. We overheard Ozpin saying that Jack Everest was the one who ordered the killing of your parents. He sent human assassins wearing white fang masks, pretending to be Faunus. Don't trust him, he's going to try to kill you. Ruby had always assumed that feral, ruthless Faunus were behind the masks. The childhood trauma had left a Ruby a prejudice and a grudge against all Faunus, until she had met Alice. Now she knew that the answer wasn't important, that Faunus and humans were rather similar, that both had the capacity for great evil. She wished she had known sooner. It didn't matter now, the most precious person in her life was gone. A small sigh escaped Ruby's lips. Thanks for the information, Young. And thank you all for trying. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. Good luck, said Weiss. Seeing that there was no more to be said, Glinda waved her wand and unceremoniously ejected the three from the room. Leaving the chamber, she reactivated the barrier, watching quietly as the three friends picked themselves up and walked down the hall in silence. 2 days later. If she survives Rogue Camp, I'll take her in. That is not what we agreed upon. Your promise means nothing if Ruby is sent to Rogue Camp anyway, Ozpin fumed. They rounded the corner and walked down the hallway, heading for the hoverjet port. Ruby was being loaded into the flying machine, blindfolded and wrapped in steel silk and glyphs. Attendants surrounded her, making sure that she was tightly secured and clearing the area for liftoff. I cannot forgive her for the death of my son, nor can I forgive her for any of her other crimes. Remember, Professor, she is also a psychopath and is quite strong. Even if I let her onto my team, I could not control her. If she ever found out that I had her parents killed, well, then God help us all. No, only you. You brought this upon yourself, and you should have dealt with it yourself. Ozpin said, a deep scowl on his face. Walking ahead of Everest, he approached Ruby. She was bound into a gurney on the tarmac, about to be rolled into the hoverjet. Stopping next to her and leaning in, he tried to give her some encouraging advice. Stay strong, Ruby. I'd like to say that I could get you out of there, but this matter is much too high up, even for me. Behave well and finish training early, and they might take you out of the camp and give you a mission. Good luck. Ozpin backed up and nodded to the nearby attendants. Everest watched as they loaded Ruby onto the aircraft. Heaving an internal sigh, he turned around and walked away. What he had said to Ozpin was true, but there was another reason why Ruby had been sent to Rogue Camp. During the 2-day extension he had given Ozpin, he had seriously considered binding Ruby's strength and training her as an assassin. However, a message from a superior had arrived, asking why Ruby hadn't been taken care of yet. The superior wanted to tie up all loose ends, and that meant finishing off the Rose family by killing the remaining child. Minors couldn't be executed, but they could be sent to a camp and accidentally get beaten to death during an overzealous training exercise, or perhaps tumble off a cliff. With a roar, the hoverjet took off, ascending into the sky and heading for the remote Rogue Camp. Chapter 13, Camp. After the hoverjet had landed, she felt herself being wheeled into the back of a truck. She was taken off of the stretcher, hands and feet still tied, and chained to thick steel shackles attached to the floor of the truck. Ruby had the physical strength to break her bindings, but the glyphs were stopping her from actually being able to move. The truck was driven for a couple more hours. Ruby had fallen asleep when she was awakened by the feeling of a thin, flat band of metal being wrapped around her throat. Her stomach growled a little, a feeling of hunger beginning to creep over her. Ruby rose, are you awake? Ruby nodded, the blindfold preventing her from identifying the speaker. Good. Listen carefully. This collar is inscribed with incineration glyphs. We, the wardens of the camp, can ignite your collar anytime, anywhere. There are 2 main rules: do not try to escape, and do not attack your wardens. Do you understand? Ruby nodded again. Where am I? She asked. The voice sounded surprised. You don't know. You're at Rogue Camp. Here, we re-educate criminals and send them out to fight Grimm on the frontiers, giving them a chance at redemption. Redemption, Ruby said slowly, tasting the word in her mouth. That sounds nice. The voice gave a chuckle. We'll see about that. There was a clink of unlocking metal, then rough hands grabbed her shoulders and pulled her out of the back of the truck. A small breeze brushed against her skin, and the glyphs on her disappeared. Her legs nearly crumpled under her, unable to support her weight after being immobile for several hours. A snip and the bindings around her ankles fell loose. The blindfold was ripped off of her face, making her eyes water and blink to compensate for the bright sunlight shining into them. We're going to the administration office to make some introductions and get you registered, said a voice to her side. Glancing around, her eyes adjusted and she saw that her speaker had been a lean, wiry man, wearing a brown uniform with short sleeves. A small badge in the shape of a circlet of barbed wire was pinned above his front pocket. A brown belt was around his waist, and he wore black dress pants. A broad-rimmed brown felt hat topped his head, shading his features from the light. Can you walk? Let's go. Her surroundings were barren, looking nothing like Beacon's Hills and the lush emerald forest. The landscape was flat in all directions, the monotony broken by an unassuming shrub or two. Everything looked windblown and flat, dust particles covering most surfaces in a layer of fine silt. The grainy earth under her bare feet felt gritty and hard, the topsoil packed and dry. The sun beat down overhead. Ruby knew she should have felt hot and dusty, but her body still felt numb, and thus there was only the mildest sensation of something warm. Ruby looked about as she walked, eventually reaching an unassuming iron gate tipped with blunted spikes. A high fence surrounded the gate, stretching onward into the distance. The camp was filled with low brown and red buildings along with an occasional guard tower. Out past the buildings, an outdoor cooking area and storage warehouses could be seen. The warden grabbed Ruby's arm and pulled her with him, his only indication of surprise upon feeling her abnormally chilly skin being a raised eyebrow. He continued on, marching through the gates, stopping at the guard station to confirm his identity and grab a set of clothing. The guard raised his eyes from his tablet to give an interested glance at Ruby's exposed chest. Ruby realized that she was still almost completely naked, the pale expanse of her skin only broken by her raised scars from bullets, blades, and stitches. Her rib cage had been slowly growing back, although some places still just wire-thin strands of bone. Usually the camp will have more people, the warden said, continuing his walk and pulling her away from the guard's stare. It is currently 0900, and most prisoners are out working or in the buildings taking lessons. You'll get more details at the administration office. Stopping at one of the low buildings, he took out a key and unlocked the door. The plate next to the entrance read 249. The camp layout is simple. Each row of buildings, starting from the main entrance, is labeled as row 100, 200, 300, all the way up to 800. Rows 100 to 600 are mostly the living quarters, while rows 600 to 800 involve the other functions of the camp. He gripped the knob and swung the door open, gesturing for Ruby to head in. This will be your permanent residency. Memorize the number and report back here by 2200 every day, unless otherwise specified. The day starts at 0530 hours, breakfast is at 0600, lunch is at 1200, and dinner is at 1800. You have half an hour in the morning to visit the various barbershops scattered throughout the camp, each of the buildings with trailing numbers of 20 or 70. You can cut your hair and nails there. The closest one to this room is at building 270. You eat your meals in the communal dining area. You will be sharing this room with one woman and two men. Prisoners are placed into residencies based on the order they arrive in camp and considering the current vacancies. No one gets special privileges. Understand? Ruby nodded, trying to wrap her mind around the military time and the deluge of information. The room was furnished sparsely, containing only 2 sets of solidly built wooden bunk beds, each placed on the either side of the room, along with a washtub and a ragged towel in the back corner. The warden grunted and moved on. These are your clothes, he said, throwing a set of fabric onto the bed. You are responsible for washing and maintaining your clothing. The laundry room is in building 808, and I recommend you dry out your clothes during the night. You will be issued clothing with different marks upon them once you demonstrate obedience and trustworthiness. No personal accessories are allowed, and any attempt at concealing weapons will be dealt with severely. I understand, Ruby said. Can you please untie my hands now? She moved forward to give him access to her bindings, but he gripped her shoulder and pulled her back. One more thing, he murmured into her ear, wrapping his arm around her. We do not interfere in conflicts between prisoners, unless they becomes too disruptive or the conflicts involve severe injuries. Therefore, he said, roughly grabbing her small breasts, you'll need to take care of yourself. As I've said before, no one gets special privileges. Ruby stiffened up, her back arching a bit as she tried to ease the uncomfortable pressure on her chest. The warden's body surrounded her, the rough fabric of his shirt scraping against her skin and making her previously numb nerves tingle. She breathed in his warm smell of dust and rock and soil, his hard body feeling as solid as stone. A lot of people are going to try to take advantage of you, he continued, moving his other hand downwards and cupping her crotch. You're young and pretty, and the female prisoner population is quite low, with few as attractive as you. Heat blossomed in her belly as his rough fingers began to stroke her wet core, moving deeper and making Ruby shudder. Suddenly, he pulled back. However, as I said earlier, we wardens have a strict no-interference policy with prisoners. You'll have to deal with your own problems, or you'd better get used to it. I understand, Ruby panted, slightly out of breath from his teasing. Pulling out a small pair of shears, he clipped the bindings on her wrists. Now put on your clothes already. We need to get to the administration office. Ruby unsteadily walked to the bed, the aching from her unsatisfied urges combined with her ever-increasing hunger making her feel ravenous. Unfortunately, it would still be a while until lunch. Picking up her clothes, she slipped on a pair of neutral gray boy shorts, a gray tank top, and a loosely fitting shirt with vertical black stripes along with similarly matching pants. A pair of nondescript leather sandals went on her feet, tightened until they stopped falling off. The warden opened the door, gesturing for Ruby to follow him. As they walked, Ruby forced herself to resist jumping the warden and instead focused on cooling off. However, even as her lust dissipated, her stomach felt even emptier by comparison. A small growl suddenly came out of her belly. The warden looked at her. I can go see if we can make an exception for you, considering your long journey. After we speak to the administration, we can head to the kitchens and grab something for you to eat before beginning your training. Ruby had a feeling that her type of hunger probably wouldn't be satiated with just a bit of food, but she held her tongue. They arrived at the administration building a few minutes later. Built of gray stone, it was slightly taller than the red brick buildings surrounding it, lending it an air of importance and solemnity. A glowing display was to the left of the double doors, a camera right over it. The warden pulled out a thin plastic card, scanning it against the display and letting the camera get a good view of him. With a small beep and a hiss, the doors opened, a rush of cool air sweeping out. The moment after the two stepped in, the doors closed and sealed shut again. The interior of the building was vastly different from Ruby's cabin, containing bright white walls and a lush gray carpet. The reception desk was made of stainless steel, gleaming as the overhead fluorescent shined down upon it. A display sat on the desk, a secretary with blue eyes and silvery hair sitting behind it. Having a sizable chest and dressed in a sharp gray suit, she had a pair of glasses on that had holographic text scrolling rapidly across the surface, controlling the flow of information with eye movements. Passing through a metal detector and ignoring the beeping, the warden walked to the reception desk. Glancing upwards, the receptionist nodded to Ruby and the warden and swiped her fingers across the screen. I've cleared you for access. The administrator is in the third room down the hall. The warden said a thank you and led Ruby down the hallway, past two unmarked doors and stopping at the third. Taking a deep breath, he was prepared to knock on the door when the door suddenly creaked open and revealed a broad, smiling face. Come in, come in. I've been expecting you, Ruby. Ruby didn't know what she had been expecting, but the administrator was certainly someone she hadn't expected to see in an office setting. Blonde hair, blue eyes, strong jaw, light stubble, and high cheekbones, he looked every bit like one of those musicians that Yang had always drooled over. He was dressed in a light blue suit, a white shirt underneath and a white and black striped tie around his neck. Sit, sit. He patted the two chairs across his desk and moved to the other side, unbuttoning his suit before slouching into the chair and crossing his legs, his arms behind his head. As you may know, I'm the administrator, he said, introducing himself. I'm afraid I can't tell you my real name, job contract and all, but I know that you are called Ruby Rose. Ruby nodded, uncertain as to how she should respond to his bright and cheerful attitude. Not a talker, I see. Well then, I'll get straight to the point. No bullshit about me asking you how you like this place and all. I know this is a terrible place, and I know that you are a murderer and psychopath, he said smiling, but that doesn't change my message. He cleared his throat, clearly having given this speech many times in the past. Here, at RWBY Camp, you work hard, learn hard, and eventually redeem yourselves. If you slack off or do not take your work seriously, you will be placed into solitary confinement and denied meals. Do well and focus, and you can be done with your training quickly and sent out to fight the Grim at the frontiers. You come here to learn how to be rogue hunters-huntresses in your case, and you will learn how to beat back the darkness and fight for the future of mankind. In your case, your weapon has been locked up in our heavily guarded armory. You will get it back upon demonstrating an ability to follow orders and after gaining our trust. As you may have already been told, your uniform have marks added to it upon being faithful and earning goodwill. Each tier will allow you more freedom and more responsibility. 1 red stripe is the beginning level, 2 green stripes is the next, then 3 blue stripes, and then finally back down to 1 black stripe. As for the camp in general, your warden has already explained to you the overall layout and functions of the camp. However, there is also one more thing. This entire area, encompassing far past this camp, is encased in a barrier. This barrier is so large that there are many square kilometers of unexplored territories within this region. This barrier is kept up by a massive dust crystal that even I don't know the location to, and is impossible to escape. It prevents all living things from escaping and immediately incinerates any foreign material that comes in contact with it. You'll need specific keys to get in and out, and virtually no one here has any of those. The reason why I'm telling you all this is because A, no bullshit between us, and B, no one has ever escaped. As for the local fauna, the area around here is dominated by Grim. You will be sent on missions to clear out Grim nests as part of your training and as part of your work. You will also collect Grim specimens for research purposes. More normal animals are scarce, so we eat Grim monsters as a supplement to our supplies. The administrator paused to regain his breath, his speech winding down. That's about it. You'll take classes on fighting Grim at sporadic times, you'll know by the announcements. Otherwise, just listen to the loudspeakers every morning for your assignments. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your warden. Do well and finish training early, and you might get out of here faster than you expected. If you experience any difficulties at the camp, know that it is part of the experience of making yourself a better person. Finished with his speech, the administrator sat up and buttoned his shirt again. And now, my break time is over. It was great meeting you, Ruby. If you don't have any further questions, you should leave quickly. I need to get back to my work, he explained apologetically. Ruby gave him a small smile and a thanks, and got up. The warden also stood up and began walking towards the door. Ruby followed him, sparing one last glance at the administrator, who was beginning to sign sheets of paper and calculate figures. They exited the building, the sun still beating down on them. The warden led Ruby towards the kitchens. We'll grab a bite to eat, and then you can go sit in on some lessons, he said. Ruby's stomach was an empty pit now, the snarling hunger in her belly growling to be filled. Thank you, she said, smiling. By the way, what can I call you? Warden just sounds weird. Just call me Warden, and if you're talking about me to anyone else, I am the Warden of 249. Our non-interference with prisoners includes the use of names, just like the administrator. Ruby sighed, her smile disappearing. This was going to be a long stay. Chapter 14, Introductions. After her morning snack, Ruby had gone off to attend one of the lessons. As she had suspected, the apple, cheese, and a bit of bread had done little to quell her appetite. The hunger inside her was a little more muted, the physical sensation of a full stomach calming in a bit, but Ruby knew she was just stalling. You won't learn much, the warden explained, unaware of her internal turmoil, compared to what you've already learned at Beacon. None of the prisoners really pay attention to the lesson, and most use it as socializing time. I suggest you get to know your future cabin mates and sort out any issues you might have with them, or at least make a deal with them. You'll be with the same people every day, during lessons, meal times, and hunting trips. Good luck, Ruby. The warden had walked away, leaving Ruby alone and standing in the middle of the empty open dining area wondering what to do. A voice came out of the loudspeakers. Prisoner D of Residence 249, report to room 620 to attend your lessons. You have 5 minutes to arrive, and your arrival will be noted. Ruby walked, taking her time, as 620 wasn't too far from the meal area. Do they have hidden speakers and cameras? She wondered. Surely they don't have enough people to track everyone during the entire day. Arriving at the classroom, she noticed that the door was ajar and that the only sound coming out was the voice of the teacher droning on about Grimm. She opened the door a little more and slipped in, a small metal device to the side of the entrance, giving a noise of acknowledgement as she stepped through the doorway. About 30 people were sitting on benches and stools, most of them looking anywhere from their 20s to their mid-40s. They fit the stereotypical image Ruby had of murderers and thieves, rough and scraggly, and a few with bulging muscles. Some had long, unkempt hair, clearly having given up and accepted their predicament, while others had bald heads or military-style crew cuts, looking determined and experienced. Others just had their heads down on the table, sleeping, while some whispered to the people next to them. There were a few women scattered about the room, most with muscles of their own and dangerous expressions. They were all staring at her as she walked in, none of them paying attention to the lesson. The teacher stood behind a desk, a textbook open on top of it. He was behind a large glowing barrier that took up 1/5 of the room, protecting him from the prisoners he was instructing. He was bored and reading from the textbook, throwing in occasional comments about sacrifice and teamwork. Ruby ignored the stares and took its seat in the corner of the room, close to the door. The person next to Ruby was face down on the desk, a mop of black hair obscuring her face as she slept. Tuning out the whispers, she attempted to hear what the teacher was saying. Nevermores are some of the toughest creatures you'll encounter. All you need to know is that their only weak points are their talons and eyes. The rest of their body is covered in extremely dense, tough feathers that are hard to cut through even with the sharpest of weapons. Thus, you'll need someone to distract the Nevermore while sending someone else to climb onto its head and stabs its eyes out. The bone plating on its head is also very tough, so make sure you aim well. Remember to send your weakest team member to distract the Nevermore, preferably by sending him or her out alone and letting the Nevermore claw the team member open. They love fresh organs for the abundant vitamins and nutrients located in them, so it will be busy eating your team member as you send someone to crawl up the bird's back. Sacrifices are always needed, and teamwork will allow you to persevere through the loss. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Lesson over, open your textbooks and go read by yourselves. The teacher sat back down and pulled out a tablet, flicking it open and focusing on the bright lights that began to flash across the screen. Ruby sighed, grabbing the textbook on the floor next to the benches and flipping it open. The tome was old and dusty, the pages covered in holes and the bindings full of book lice. The text was nearly unreadable, the ink faded and the words in some archaic form of language. She realized that the camp clearly had no intention of ensuring the survival of their prisoners. She gave up and closed the book, looking around. Once the lesson had ended, the prisoners had begun talking, hushed whispers spreading across the room. A mousy man got up from his chair, a brown mop of messy hair on his head and looking to be about 30. He walked over to Ruby, a grin spreading across his face, showing his crooked teeth and pockmarked skin. Another man also got up at the same time, one of the muscle-bound men with a crew cut. He had a jutting brow with deep-set eyes and a square jaw, his uniform seeming hardly able to contain him. Ruby noted the 2 green stripes on both of their shoulders as they walked towards her. The thin man stopped at her desk while the other man slapped his palm on the table, making the black-haired girl next to her jerk awake, wide-eyed. She looked at the men questioningly, then realized their object of attention and turned to Ruby. She had medium-length black hair, a light complexion, and startling green eyes. Faint bruises rimmed the underside of her eyes, giving her pretty face a weary expression. I'm John, and this is Bruiser, the mousy man said, an accent tinging his voice. So you're the new arrival, huh? Bruiser said in a deep voice, with no sign of expression on his face. Ruby wasn't sure how to respond, so she also kept her face neutral and nodded. My name's Ruby. Nice to meet you, I guess, she responded. John's grin grew wider. Nice to meet you too, darling. I'm sure we'll get to know each other very well tonight. Bruiser grunted and pointed at the black-haired girl. That's Julie, but we just call her the bitch. She's our other cabin mate. She used to blab her mouth all the time, but now she's usually too busy to talk. Isn't that right, bitch? To emphasize his last point, he grabbed her hair and gave it a tug. Why don't you tell Ruby here what happened? Even as she spoke, her frightened eyes told the story. I used to talk a lot, but these two peo. She gave a cry of pain as Bruiser tugged on her hair again, gulping. These two gentlemen showed me where I was wrong, and I've learned my lesson now. Bruiser let go her hair, giving her a parting sneer. We'll be having more time together in the future, Ruby, John said, turning and walking away. Bruiser followed on his heels, the two walking back to a group of people who seemed to be handing little scraps of paper to each other. John whispered something, and the group of people suddenly roared with laughter, echoing across the room. Julie flinched a little, then sighed and put her head on the table again. Ruby poked her shoulder. So Julie, how's camp so far? She asked. Julie turned her head to stare at her. The two bastards kept me up all night. With you here, maybe they'll ignore me and I can get some damn sleep. She turned back, finished with her conversation. Ruby frowned, a little annoyed at her attitude. Gazing at her, the hunger inside gave a little spike as Julie's hair settled onto the table, exposing her neck. Ruby leaned over her, breathing in Julie's smell of spun sugar. Julie felt Ruby's breath on her neck and tried to get up. What the foo? Ruby slammed her head back into the table, gripping her skull and pushing her against it. You smell nice, Ruby said. Moving her lips to Julie's neck, she licked it and tasted her, nibbling at her with her teeth. Breaking a layer of skin, she tasted a bit of blood and flesh. Get off me, you little freak. Julie cried, pushing herself up with her arms and trying to get her legs out from under the table. A catcall sounded out as Ruby bit. Some people had been watching and they clearly appreciated the sight. Ruby realized where she was and backed off, releasing Julie's head. Whoops, sorry, couldn't control myself a little there, Ruby said apologetically, wiping the drool off the corner of her mouth. Julie stared at her. Are you a fucking vampire or something? Stay the fuck away from me. She stood up and moved to a table across the room. Ruby rubbed her chin with her sleeve, getting the last few remnants of saliva. Realizing that she did have a bit of similarity with the fictional creatures, she chuckled to herself. She had to do something about her hunger, or she might just accidentally invoke the warden's wrath on her first day. Flipping the textbook open again, she focused on the text and began attempting to make sense of what she was reading, trying to stifle her need. Lunch was a thin soup, cooked in large cauldrons that were suspended over fires. Ruby filled her bowl and sat at table 249, watching the prisoners stream in from the various gates around the camp. Most of them were dusty and bloody, some supporting their teammates while others limped along by themselves. Some of the uninjured ones pulled carts behind them filled with weapons, small grim, and the limbs and other parts of larger ones. Someone tapped her shoulder, and she looked up. The warden was standing next to her, so she scooted over and he sat down. Those are the people who are coming back from Grim hunting, the warden explained. You'll probably go hunt Grim about once a week. These went to clear out a Death Stalker nest, which are pretty common around here. Some of the more injured ones will be given a reasonable amount of time to recuperate, but our medical facilities aren't very good and the people with more serious injuries usually die. You might be able to ask for treatment from some of the aura healers around camp, but there are very few, as most healers don't usually commit offenses severe enough to be sent here. Ruby nodded as he spoke, drinking down the bland soup and making a face. It tasted faintly of various meats and dried vegetables mixed together along with a hint of bitterness, the reconstituted vegetable bits tasting like paper. The warden, seeing her expression, grinned a bit, the smile never reaching his eyes. The food at lunch is bad, but at dinner the day's catch will have been sorted out and you'll have some fresh meat to eat. The vegetables we get are all from the monthly shipments, and they're usually just dried or pickled ones. The soups will have some vitamins and minerals thrown in from the nutritional packets we get, so it might taste a bit weird but it'll keep your strength up. There was a growing roar of conversation as nearly 3,000 prisoners began file into the mess area, lining up at the cauldrons to grab their own bowls of soup and sitting down in various places, ignoring the labeled tables. One more thing, Ruby, the warden said. Now that you've seen how life at camp is, you have to realize something. All of the people sent here are serial killers, unrepentant murderers, drug traffickers, slavery ring operators, and so forth, just like you, Ruby. Don't feel too much sympathy for anyone. Ruby said, focused on her food. She didn't really need him to tell her. She knew what she had done and she suspected that others had committed similar offenses. At this point, Ruby didn't really care about what was going on around her and instead worked on quelling her appetite. John and Bruiser headed towards Ruby, Julie nowhere in sight. They sat down in front of her, continuing their conversation and ignoring her. The warden cleared his throat. I assume you've all introduced yourselves. John and Bruiser nodded, never meeting the warden's gaze. Yes sir, we met our Ruby at the lesson, Sir John simpered. Julie's eating lunch by herself again, Sir Bruiser said, explaining her absence. The warden nodded. Well, I'll leave you 3B. You better get along now, you hear me? John and Bruiser nodded, and the warden walked away. The moment he left, they turned towards her. You see those people walking back from the hunting expedition? John asked. Yeah, Ruby answered, wondering what he was going on about. I figure that if I rent you and the bitch out to our neighbors, we can get a little bit of protection during them expeditions. I see, Ruby said quietly. Thanks for the offer, but I don't really want to make the wardens angry. Angry? John exclaimed incredulously. The wardens don't give a shit about what we do, darling. As long as we don't kill anyone, they don't give a single flying fuck. So how about it? You don't understand, Ruby said, getting up. My answer is no, sorry. Bruiser was getting angry. This isn't a fucking offer, Ruby. Do it or we'll force you to do it, your decision. Shaking her head, Ruby walked away. Bruiser got up to follow her, but John put a hand on his arm. Don't make a ruckus out here, there's too many of them damn wardens around. We'll teach her how to follow orders tonight. Bruiser sat back down, growling. He picked up his bowl of soup and gulped it down. Oh, we'll teach her, all right. Finishing the rest of her soup, Ruby set her bowl down at the edge of the eating area. She decided to take a walk and explore the camp to settle down her emotions and to scout the place out. Apparently the prisoners were free to go anywhere during lunch hours and downtime, as long as they didn't leave the camp. She followed the paths winding between the buildings, noting down where the armory was at, where the fences were, and so forth. She saw some groups of people playing cards or rolling dice, handing around small scraps of paper whenever they lost or won. Sometimes, walking between buildings, she heard the sounds of lovemaking, some willing and others not so much. Ruby walked quickly by when she heard them, mostly to stop herself from joining in. About half an hour later, the loudspeaker came back on. Residencies in Block 100, report to Building 790. Residencies in Block 200, report to Building 780. Arrive by 1300. Curious, she hurried to the buildings. Arriving quickly, she noticed the crowd of people gathered around the area. At first confused as to how all the people would fit inside the squat red structures, she noticed wardens arriving and directing groups of people to the buildings between 780 and 790. Finding her warden in the crowd was hard, but as the people went into the buildings and the crowd thinned, she saw him standing outside room 784, his arms crossed and waiting. Hurry up, it's starting, he said, ushering her in. Ruby walked into the building and found a bench, sitting down. The room was organized similarly to the classroom she had been earlier in the day, the benches positioned in rows. However, the warden at the front didn't need a barrier, instead relying on his own authority and strength to keep himself safe. In about 3 days you will be sent to clear out a Borbatusk cave and a Deathstalker nest. This assignment will be unusual, as some of you will be tasked with capturing a few young Borbatusks to bring back. If successful, those Borbatusks will be bred and domesticated to allow for a constant supply of fresh meat. A few happy murmurs came from the crowd upon hearing the last statement. Tomorrow, the selected hunters will be given lessons on subduing and capturing Borbatusk. Details on where to convene and at what time will be given on the day of the hunt. Use the next 3 days to train yourselves and prepare. The training grounds will be open from 0600 to 2100. Any questions? The 40 or so people in the room had begun whispering among themselves upon hearing the news, but none of them voiced any questions. Alrighty then. You are all dismissed. That was fast, Ruby thought as she stood up to exit. Moving towards the door, she was surprised when a hand grasped her bottom and an arm went under her chest, pulling her back into the rows of benches. Hello, a masculine voice whispered in her ear. I'm Benjamin, but you can call me Ben. How about we go and have some fun after this? Looking up, she stared into gray blue eyes set in a good-looking, clean-shaven face, with short blonde hair and a strong jaw. Ruby had expected the offers to occur and sorely wanted to accept them, but she told herself that she didn't want to cause any trouble and ruin her chances of surviving through the camp. Regretting it, she slapped his hand away a little harder than she had intended to, a little pop sounding out as two of his fingers dislocated. He hissed and pulled his hand back, roughly grabbing his fingers and jamming them back into place. Damn, girl, if you didn't want to do anything you should have just said so, he said angrily, rushing past her and heading for the exit. Ruby felt a little guilty at injuring his pride, but she stuffed those feelings down and also exited the building, heading in the opposite direction she saw Ben leave in. She couldn't risk going to the training grounds, afraid that the energy and violence would loosen her self-control too much. Walking a bit further, she chose an empty alleyway and sat down, knees to her chest and arms around them. Breathing a sigh of relief as she sat there in silence, away from people, she slowly nodded off, head on her knees, as she dreamed of the world she had lost. Chapter 15, Struggle Snuggle. Warning, this chapter is violent. Skim the violent areas and skip to the next paragraph for plot if you do not wish to read them. This warning will only appear in applicable chapters. Ruby woke up, the sound of the dinner chimes from the loudspeaker ringing in her ears. The sun was beginning to slip under the horizon, the last rays of light casting her surroundings in an orange glow. Her stomach growled, reminding her of not just the physical hunger but also her emotional aching. Maybe I'll go pay Julie a visit, she thought to herself as she stood up, stretching to get rid of the cramps she had from sleeping in an awkward position. Straightening out her sleeves and pants and dusting herself off, she started walking towards the dining area. As she walked, she noticed a lot of people coming from the training area, sweaty and exhausted. Ruby watched enviously as they patted each other on the backs and laughed together, reveling in their social contact. Once I deal with my issue, I can go make some friends. After all, we're all criminals here. The smell of roasting meat pervaded her senses as she stepped into the dining area. Roasts of all sizes and shapes were on spits above flames, shimmering with fat and oil and the promise of satisfaction. Stacks of towels were next to them, used by prisoners to wipe themselves clean after eating. Many had already arrived before her and were tearing into the meat on the spits. Denied of sharp knives and eating utensils, the prisoners tore off chunks with their bare hands, wiping them down on nearby towels. Ruby waited until some cooks set up another spit, spearing the raw meat onto a metal rod and hoisting it over the campfire. After they had walked off, Ruby waited a few seconds for the surface of the meat to heat up. She then gripped the roast tightly and ripped off a large chunk, the sound of flesh separating with a wet squelch. Holding the warm meat in her hands, she grabbed a plate and plopped it down, walking off to her table. She ripped into the raw meat, savoring the blood and warmth. This was a last-ditch attempt at attempting to quell her hunger, trying to trick herself into thinking that she was holding a live person, eating their writhing flesh and drinking their blood. Unfortunately, the moment the meat entered her mouth she tasted its deadness, its lack of living scent. Refusing to give up, she ate more and more, tearing off larger and larger chunks. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed someone at another table pointing at her and talking to the three people next to him. Ruby recognized one of them as Ben, who was whispering into the man's ear and grabbing his arm. The man snorted and shook Ben off, and got up to get more food. Ben gave up and shook his head, sighing. Unable to effect her inner desire, she got up quickly and began walking to her cabin, hoping to find Julie. Unnoticed by her, the man also got up and followed after her. Ruby arrived at the cabin, still ravenous in more ways than one. Opening the door, she called Julie. Are you there? Ruby stepped into the room and attempted to close the door behind her, only to find the bulk of a man filling the doorway, his blunt yellow teeth looking monstrous in the dim light. Hello, little girl. Do you want to play? he asked nastily, closing the door behind him. Ruby's vision swam, the man's profile in startling clarity but with everything around him blurry and tinged with red. Yes, yes I do, she said happily, grabbing his arm and pulling him towards her. Ben walked home with his two companions, Scrap and John. Scrap was a pathetic scrap of a man, as his namesake suggested, but was otherwise loyal to the bone. Ben also personally disliked John and his suck-up attitude, but John had influence over Bruiser and Bruiser was a valuable ally. The other man, Denton, had left before they finished dinner, chasing after Ruby. They walked towards John's cabin, John excitedly talking about the arrival and what he was going to do to her. Ben had seen her during the hunting briefing, but she had rejected him and his protection. Now whatever happened to her was her own fault. Screaming came from the residence in front of them. That's probably Denton breaking the new bitch and John laughed. His grin faded as he realized that the screams were masculine in nature. He sprinted towards the house, Ben and Scrap running after him. Denton, you okay in there? John whined, fingers fumbling as he tried to grasp the doorknob. The door swung open and they rushed in, stopping cold seconds later, trying to wrap their minds around what they were seeing. Denton was on the floor, a pool of blood growing around him as Ruby crouched on top of him, gnawing on a white and red object in her hands. Reaching down into Denton's chest and snapping off another object, Ben realized with growing horror that she was crunching on Denton's ribs. There were dark spaces where some ribs were missing, the gleam of Denton's heart visible through the gaps. Denton's screaming were growing weaker as Ben watched the blood pour from his savage limbs, his arms torn off at the shoulders and his legs missing below the kneecap. Every time Denton spasmed and tried to unseat Ruby, she merely slammed a foot into his shoulder, the snapping and grinding of bone fragments clearly audible. Ruby looked up, cracking a bone open and sucking down the marrow. Sorry for the noise, I got a bit hungry and fresh meat tastes better with the scent of pain and fear. She looked down again, seemingly just realizing what she had done. Oh man, I think I went a little too far. Do you guys want to take him for treatment or can I finish? Get off of him, Ben said, his face tight and drawn. Ruby was puzzled, sitting still as she considered what he said. I said, get off of him. Ben screamed, rushing up to push Ruby away. Ruby evaded his hands and shoved him back, staining his clothes with blood and pieces of flesh. All right, she said, jumping off of him and moving to lean against the bed. Ben got to his knees and cradled Denton's head in his hands. Calm down, Ben murmured, we're here for you. We stopped her, shush, everything will be okay. The wet rasping noise that had been Denton's screaming finally stopped, tears still streaming down his eyes as he blubbered. It hurts, he said hoarsely, Ben, the bitch was eating me alive, oh god, it hurts so much. Make it stop, Ben, make it stop. Ben lowered his head and whispered in the man's ear. The man nodded, a relieved expression on his face. Uttering a small prayer, Ben took Denton's head in his hands and twisted, silencing Denton's whimpering. Ben turned and stared at Ruby, an unreadable expression on his face. Run down to the administration office and tell them what happened, he told Scrap, who took off immediately, eager to get away from the scene. Ruby had stretched out on the bed, her hunger satisfied and warm meat filling her belly, hands behind her head as she drowsily began to nod off when the sound of clomping boots woke her up and a light was shined into her eyes. Get up, Ruby, her warden said, motioning for her to step outside. Two medical workers entered the room to pick up the Denton's body, Ben following them as they carried the body to the medical facilities. The sun had already set, the darkness only broken by a bright white light as Ruby stepped outside. The administrator was standing there, holding a glowing lantern and looking at her with a disappointed expression. First day and already killing people? The administrator asked, stepping aside to reveal a man in a green scrub behind him. Well, it's been a long day, and technically Ben killed him, Ruby offered. You know, he said slowly, Ben is my brother. He fell into a despicable life of crime after our parents died, but I gave him a chance to come here to make up for what he's done. He sighed and shook his head. Well, that's all in the past now. He gestured for the man in the green scrub to come forward. As you've said, technically Ben killed Denton, and so the only thing we can punish you for is grievous bodily injury. Because of the nature of your offenses, we've decided to restrict your strength and lower your aura to the bare minimum. Ruby Ruby shrugged, uncaring. She was happy and sated and blissful right now, the hunger still in her mind but satisfied and willing to let smaller issues take precedence. The man in green held a pile of metal spikes in his hands, each of them about half an inch in diameter and of varying lengths, carved with glyphs that were emitting a small blue glow. There are 96 spikes in total. 4 go in your upper arms, 4 in your lower arms, 8 in your upper legs, and 8 in your lower legs, the man said gruffly. It's going to hurt when we put them in. Do you want to do it here, or would you prefer to be sedated at the medical facility? Here, Ruby said. Let's get this over with so I can go to sleep. The man nodded, pulling out a small mallet. We'll need something to brace your arm on, to make sure I don't fracture your bones. Ruby thought for a second. We could do it on the bed, she said, giggling a bit at the innuendo. The administrator let out another little sigh and the man in scrubs frowned. Ruby led the way, stopping at her bed and lying down, arms and legs spread out. There was a slight sensation of pain and discomfort whenever a spike went in, but it was nothing compared to the heartache she had gone through. Working quickly and efficiently, he was done in less than a minute. Ruby stood up, wobbling a bit, feeling the spikes dig into her muscles and attach themselves, becoming part of her. The pieces of metal protruded a bit from her legs and arms, the glow in them fading and disappearing. The hunger in her mind was suddenly heavily muted, as if a lead blanket had been placed over it. Impressive, the administrator said. I think you're the only one who hasn't been screaming while these were being put in. Ruby realized that her hunger didn't limit her anymore. It was still there, but smothered, and Ruby was sure that her urges would come less frequently and less strongly now. Thank you, she said, smiling brightly. The administrator raised an eyebrow but said nothing, leading the man in green scrubs out of the room. Ruby turned back to the bed, just noticing the blood that was leaking out of the holes in her arms. Oh crud, the bed's covered in blood, she exclaimed. She heard the administrator chuckle at her outburst as he walked away. She sighed and resigned herself to sleeping the dirty bed. However, she had to do something about her bloody clothes. Going to the corner of the room with the washtub, she picked it up in her sore arms and wondered where she could fill it with water. Small lights suddenly turned on in the corners of the room, seemingly activating based on the light conditions, the few previously unnoticed lights barely illuminating the floor and the beds. Walking out the door, she noticed that the paths between the houses were also lit with hidden light sources under the sandy dirt, lighting up the road and lending the buildings a soft glow. A few seconds down the path, she bumped into Julie, who was returning to the cabin. Hey, Julie. Ruby said brightly, glad to have found someone she knew. Do you know where I can fill this thing? Julie backed up upon seeing her, a snarl on her face. She turned and began running in the opposite direction. Wait up, Ruby said, running after her. Although her strength had been restricted, she still had a decent amount left and her endurance hadn't been affected, so she chased after Julie effortlessly, eventually catching up to her, throwing the washtub onto the ground and tackling her. Get off, Julie panted, weakly pushing at Ruby. Ruby still wanted to eat her, but she could control those urges now. Resisting her impulses, she just gave Julie a little kiss on the cheek and sat up. Only if you tell me where I can get water, Ruby said, grinning. Julie gave up on struggling, instead taking deep breaths and trying to recover. The communal pumps are in block 300, in the center of the row of residences. Thank you, Ruby beamed, flipping Julie over and giving her a peck on the lips before she could react. Standing up quickly, she trotted off to the pump, where she found a small line of people waiting, most of them tired and sleepy and willing to ignore her. A few stared at the spikes in her arms and legs but averted their gaze when Ruby looked back at them. She might go use the laundry rooms tomorrow, but right now she was sleepy and needed her rest. After waiting a few minutes, she got her washtub filled and walked back to the cabin carefully to prevent any water from spilling. Setting the washtub down and opening the door, she tried to remain silent in order to avoid disturbing anyone who might be sleeping. Julie was already in bed in her clothes, trying to get some sleep in before John and Bruiser came back. She was awakened by the sound of Ruby shouldering the door closed behind her. Already sleeping? Ruby asked, setting down the washtub and beginning to strip. Julie swore under her breath. I have to be in here because of the stupid rules, she said, so stay the hell away from me, alright? I already get enough shit from John and Bruiser. Looking closer, she noticed Ruby's arms and legs. What the hell happened to you? Oh my god, do you have some sort of sick body modification fetish? 'Cause that's just wrong, and where the hell did you even find the spikes? Ruby had finished taking off her clothes, the dim lighting giving her pale skin a gentle warmth, the metal in her arms and legs gleaming. Ignoring Julie's question, she washed her hands and limbs of blood, her wounds already healed. The clothes were dropped into the washtub, Ruby letting them soak. Taking her time, she picked up the toothbrush in the corner and brushed her teeth, rinsing her mouth. After she was done, she turned and started walking towards Julie, who had been staring gleaming metal in her arms, mesmerized. Breaking off her gaze, Julie noticed Ruby approaching. Wait, stay back, damn it. Ignoring her protests, Ruby crawled into bed next to her, the sharp pieces of metal catching on the blankets. Julie pushed against her and tried to roll out of bed, but Ruby caught her arms and drew her into her body, cuddling her. The edges of the spikes bit through Julie's clothing and nipped at Julie's skin, drawing a bit of blood and making her whimper. We can just cuddle if you want, Ruby said, sighing and leaning her head on Julie's shoulder, breathing her sweet scent in. These clothes sure are pesky though. With that thought, Ruby sat up, hauling Julie up with her and pulling Julie's shirt over her head. She then flipped Julie over, gripping her pants and pulling them off in one stroke. No, stop, Julie cried, give those back. Ruby wasn't finished yet. She grabbed Julie's tank top and also took it off, along with her panties. There we go, Ruby crooned, grabbing Julie's neck and crotch and pulling her toward her. Julie whined as she felt the metal on Ruby's arms scratching her back and breasts, blood welling from the shallow cuts. She shuddered a little as Ruby began licking them, renewing her efforts to get free. Shush, I just want to cuddle, Ruby repeated, grazing Julie's skin with her teeth as a promise of what might happen, but we can get more serious if you want. Julie stopped struggling, tears running down her face as she let Ruby fondle her breasts and lick her cuts until she fell asleep. With Ruby asleep, she tried once more to wriggle out of her grasp, but Ruby growled a little and tightened her grip, making Julie freeze. She sniffled a little and waited for John and Bruiser to return. An hour later, the two men had gathered up enough courage to go into the cabin, afraid of what might be awaiting them. They stepped into the room, the bloodstains on the floor and bits of tissue in the corner reminding them of what they had heard from Scrap. They were a bit disappointed when they saw that Julie had been taken, but they knew better than to disturb the girl who had eaten Denton's ribs and tiptoed around her, going to their own beds. Seeing that not even her other two cabin mates would help her, fresh tears began to flow from Julie's face, silently crying and afraid to wake Ruby up. Resigning herself and going limp, she finally slipped into a slumber, completely exhausted. Chapter 16. Acquaintances. The dim morning light shone down on her as Ruby strolled down the path, wearing just her tank top and shorts. The sun was coming up and the temperature was beginning to rise. Ruby was surprised she could feel the heat, not as strongly as she should be feeling it but still more than her previous numbness. She had woken up earlier than the morning bells, a nagging thought in the back of her head, begging to be let out. Her hunger was sleeping now, even more muted than the day before. Taking advantage of the fact that most prisoners were still asleep, she took a silent walk around the camp, alone in her own mind. The first thought penetrated the weakened veil of lust. What am I doing here? Ruby wondered, kicking at the pebbles on the sides of the path. Redemption. Yes, redemption. I'll serve my time here and then all. Her footsteps faltered, Ruby pausing in the middle of the street. And then what? Ruby began walking again, considering her options. Well, I haven't really done anything yet, and this darn collar is still around my throat. Maybe after we go monster hunting I'll think of something to do. Satisfied with her own answer, she headed back to the cabin, arriving just as the loudspeaker began to chime. Ruby put on her soaking shirt and pants, having forgotten to take them out of the washtub the previous night. The soggy coldness chilled her skin, but she knew the rising sun would soon dry them. Sitting down at the edge of the bed, she watched as Julie's eyes slowly opened. Good morning, Julie, she cheered. Julie jerked back quickly upon hearing her voice, giving a little squeak and hitting her head on the wall. Wah. What do you want? We're going to have breakfast soon. Well, I mean I'm going to have breakfast soon or there will be breakfast soon. No offense, not that I don't want to have breakfast with you, But back to the topic, I don't think you have any time to. Ruby put a finger on her lips, silencing her. Shish, Ruby said. You talk a lot, you know that. I just wanted to watch you wake up, she said, smiling. Julie shivered. John and Bruiser were also getting up, putting on their clothes and studiously ignoring Ruby. Good morning to you too, Ruby said, turning and grinning at them. They didn't respond. Ruby shrugged to herself, content to ignore them if they wanted to ignore her. Well, I'm off to get breakfast, she declared. Turning and running out the door, Ruby was eager to get the day started. The sounds of grunts and smacks echoed across the field, the training ground already full of people. Having eaten a quick breakfast of porridge and an orange, Ruby had immediately gone to the training area, eager to participate now that she had her appetite on a leash. The training ground was basically a gigantic field, with sections cordoned off for various types of activities. Some sections had obstacle courses, tall wooden structures with asymmetric proportions and handholds sticking out, while other sections had straw dummies, wood rods supplied for prisoners to practice with. An archery field also took up a large amount of space, each bow and arrow labeled with a tracking device that prevented its removal from the archery section. There was also a general weapons section, with a selection of wooden swords, axes, spears, and so forth for prisoners to use to spar with each other. Wardens were everywhere, standing guard and making sure that no prisoners died or tried to steal and hide weapons. Ruby headed to the straw dummies, eager to smash and destroy something. Entering the section and grabbing a rod, she spent an hour pretending she was wielding her scythe, systematically smacking around and then exploding each dummy with a concentrated smash, leaving behind a pile of ripped cloth and straw. After ruining countless dummies, the wardens finally noticed what she was doing, coming over and yelling at her for destroying the straw mannequins and forcing her to rebuild them. Another 2 hours was spent stuffing straw back into cloth sacks and setting them upright. Vowing to never return to the dummy section, she headed to the sparring area, grabbing a long wooden halberd and trying to find someone to spar with. A man and a woman walked towards her, one olive-skinned and dark hair, the other pale with bright red-orange hair in a bun on her head. The man held a spear, while the woman held 2 swords. Ruby stopped walking, wondering if they were going to attack her. To her surprise, the man grinned, pearly white teeth showing, while the woman also gave her a smile. So you're the one everyone's been talking about, he said. I heard you tortured Denton to within an inch of his life. And then I ate him, Ruby said quietly. They paused for a second. Well, I never liked the man anyway, the woman said, giving a little chuckle. So you eat people, huh? You gonna eat us too? Ruby opened up a little, their warm attitudes easing her. Not if I can help it, she said, baring her teeth and smirking. Ooh, feisty, the man laughed, holding out his hand. I'm Maximilian, she's Lily, the woman interrupted, barging in front of him and glaring at him. I can introduce myself, thank you very much. The two held their glares for a few seconds before breaking apart and laughing, sharing an inside joke between themselves. Nice to meet you, Ruby said, taking her hand and shaking it. So, do you guys want to practice? Yep, that's what we're here for, Maximilian said, immediately crouching and settling into a stance. Lily backed off to the side, giving them space to fight. Ruby pretended to raise her halberd into a defensive position, then immediately struck, disregarding strategy or fighting style. Utilizing her weapon's length, she swung lightning fast in a massive arc, Maximilian barely having time to raise his weapon before Ruby's halberd slammed into it. With a resounding crack, the two weapons shattered, wood fragments flying in all directions. Without a pause, Ruby leapt forward, landing on one foot and pivoting, turning her forward momentum into a quick roundhouse kick, her foot smacking into Maximilian's crossed arms. As Ruby had suspected, Maximilian was an aura user, the small tint of brown rising off of his skin indicating the activation of his aura. Glad she hadn't misjudged and accidentally killed him, she continued her attack, bringing her foot back down to the ground and sweeping her leg under him to knock him off of his feet. Maximilian leapt a few inches into the air, just enough to avoid her kick. Setting one foot down, he stabilized himself and aimed a snap kick at Ruby's stomach. Catching hold of his foot with an oof, Ruby held on, letting herself be swung upwards as he raised his leg in an axe stomp to try to make her let go. Realizing he was going to slam her into the ground, she let go of his foot, flying back a few feet and landing and rolling, quickly standing back up. Maximilian backed off, letting Lily take his place. "My turn," Lily said, grinning and throwing her another halberd. In her hands she held two short swords. Without any flashy spinning or readjusting, she walked quickly towards Ruby, crossing the swords in front of her. Ruby caught the halberd reflexively. Realizing that her halberd was unwieldy and not suited for close-range fighting, she broke off half of the handle on her knee, transforming it into a short axe of some sort. Suddenly, Lily was upon her, swinging her swords in a blur, an orange aura around her and waves of heat rippling outwards from each swing. Ruby ducked low and swung her axe at Lily's knees, aiming for an unprotected area. A sword flashed down and intercepted her axe, catching the head of Ruby's weapon and knocking it aside. Instantly letting go of her axe, Ruby stood up and punched towards Lily's neck, attempting to disable her. A sword swung back up to block, only to be shattered by Ruby's fist. Lily moved her head to the side, her pale green eyes open wide as Ruby's knuckles barely missed her jaw. Ruby brought her other hand up, catching the arm that still had the sword, and brought down her other fist, grabbing Lily's shoulder. Before she could react, Ruby had flipped over her and locked her arm behind her, unbalancing Lily and letting herself fall back and push her to the ground. Unmgpir, Lily said. Huh. She spat out a mouthful of dirt, coughing. "I surrender." "Oh, sorry." Ruby immediately got off and extended a hand, pulling Lily to her feet. "Are you okay?" she asked. "The only thing that's bruised is my pride," Lily laughed, "and my face." Maximilian rushed over to her side, helping her dust her clothes off and turning to face Ruby. "Sorry, we get a bit too eager sometimes," he said apologetically. Ruby thought she detected a proud glint in their eyes, but decided not to comment. "So, are you guys ready for another round?" The two just grinned and rushed her. Ruby brought the bowl up to her mouth, swallowing a mouthful of the stale liquid and setting it back down. Lily and Maximilian sat across from her, shoulder to shoulder. They watched her eat, bowls empty in front of them, clearly waiting for her to begin asking questions. "So, how'd you two get locked up in here?" Ruby asked, wiping her mouth. The couple glanced at each other, and Lily began talking. "Usually prisoners don't tell each other these things, because we try to avoid mentioning our pasts. But for you, we can make an exception." She paused, taking a breath. "We were smugglers, dealing with rare, high-quality, high-density dust crystals." Seeing Ruby's puzzled expression, she clarified. "It's those crystals you see in display cases on the news and in your textbooks. The really large, shiny crystals, bigger than a man's head." "Whoa," Ruby said. "Aren't those really dangerous? I heard that strong glyph users use them to just explode bewish entire areas of Grim." Lily nodded. "And they can be used to bewish people too, which is why they are so dangerous. I suspect that the crystal powering this camp's barrier must be exceptionally powerful and the controllers especially skilled, if they are able to maintain such stability over such a long period of time." Max cleared his throat. "So, back on topic," he said. "Long story short, we got caught smuggling the crystals and we were sent to prison. These crystals can cause huge amounts of damage, so transporting them illegally is a pretty serious offense, with most cases ending in capital punishment. Because we were young and foolish," Lily punched his arm, "ahem, not saying we still aren't, we got off with a slap on the wrist by pleading ignorance." Lily continued. "Of course, Max here had the brilliant scheme of trying to transport them again, saying that this time the crystals would be completely hidden," Lily mimicking his voice. Max blushed a bit, the tinge of pink nearly unnoticeable over his bronze skin. "Anyways, we were caught again, only this time because a raid was conducted on the same ship we were transporting things on. We got caught in the search when they started questioning all the passengers." His face grew somber. "When they saw our crystals, they tried to take them by force and attacked us. We fought back, but we were eventually cornered in our room on the ship. They basically ended up grenading us and pumping us full of bullets." Lily had grown quiet too. A few moments passed before she spoke again. We somehow survived, too pitifully injured to execute. They expected us to die, and when we didn't, they just sent us to this rogue camp. She paused. So now you know our story. How did you get sent here? Ruby hesitated a bit, wondering if she should tell them. She made a decision and shook her head. Maybe later, Ruby said, a sad note in her voice. We understand, Lily nodded. We've had our fair share of traumatic experiences. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, Ruby finishing her lunch and enjoying their company. The loudspeaker suddenly sounded out, making an announcement. All prisoners from Block 200 previously selected for the monster hunting expedition, please report to the custom area of the training grounds by 13:30 for Borbatusk training. A few cheers came up from the tables around her, some prisoners clearly happy about being selected to fight the grim pigs instead of the fearful Death Stalkers. Well, I better go, Ruby said regretfully. It was really nice meeting you too, she said, beaming. Likewise, Maximilian and Lily said. Stay safe, Ruby, and good luck. Ruby nodded and walked off, heading back to the training grounds. Chapter 17, Training. Warning. This chapter is violent. Skim the violent areas and skip to the next paragraph for plot if you do not wish to read them. This warning will only appear in applicable chapters. The custom area of the training grounds was exactly what the name implied, able to be adapted for various types of events. Right now all the structures and implements had been taken down, leaving a vast, bare field. The 400 or so prisoners were gathered in a crowd, silent as the warden spoke. The next monster hunting expedition will involve the clearing of a Borbatusk herd in a Death Stalker nest. Your block has been selected for the Borbatusk portion of the expedition. While part of your job will be to kill the Borbatusks, you will also need to capture a few alive. The person who brings in the most Borbatusks will be able to request a favor from the administrator. Those who do not bring in a Borbatusk will be forced to maintain the training grounds and clean the latrines. The warden motioned for another warden to bring him a wooden object. This, he said, holding it up in the air, is a device used to subdue the Borbatusks. The tough hide of the Borbatusks usually means that most of your attacks will be focused on attacking their vital parts and killing them, which goes against your objective. Thus, you will use this specially designed wooden paddle. One side will be covered in sharp hooks, allowing you to penetrate the hides of the Borbatusks yet refrain from delivering fatal wounds. The hooks will be blunted for this exercise. Any questions? There was some muttering, but nobody voiced their opinions. Great, the warden said. If you're feeling bored, you'll be glad to know that you'll be practicing against each other. A roar suddenly came out, the crowd of people getting excited. A few started brawling, forcing wardens to go in and break them apart. Don't go overboard, just get used to the weight of the weapons. Without any further delays, we will begin. Come up and grab a paddle. The prisoners rushed forward, grabbing paddles from the piles at the front and immediately turning on each other, some people sparring with friends and learning to use the weapons while others sought out rivals and began beating them down. When things got too violent, wardens ran in and confiscated their weapons, roughing them up and sending them to stand on the sidelines. Ruby grabbed a paddle, hefting its weight. It was made out of a solid slice of wood, one side covered in blunted hooks. The weapon was head-heavy, unbalanced and unwieldy. Ruby thought she could manage, but she still felt like she would do much better with her real weapon. Looking up, she saw one of the wardens in her area being called away. The warden protested a bit, but the voice from the tablet he was talking into insisted and he walking away, frowning. A blur appeared in her vision and Ruby raised her paddle, blocking the attack with a glancing impact and jumping back. 5 people stood in front of her, Ben the only one Ruby recognized. In the group was a bear faunus and a ram faunus, one recognizable by his round ears and the other recognizable by the horns that curled from the side of his head all the way back to his jaw. The other 2 were a man with long, greasy hair, his face unshaven and his eyes a little wild, and a girl with a crew cut, her bulging muscles lending her an Amazonian look. All of them held modified paddles in their hands, a ring of metal surrounding the outside of the wood and the hooks on them sharpened and gleaming. Ben spoke first. Now that you've got those spikes in you, how about we have a little fun? Ben sneered, flipping the paddle in his grip. They told us our sentences in this hellhole would be shortened by a year if we got rid of you, the man with the oily hair said nervously, one eye twitching. Shut up, Richard. Oh yes, and one more thing. I have to repay you for killing Denton, Ben snarled, emphasizing the last two words. Without warning, the Amazon blurred forward, swinging her paddle. Ruby brought her own paddle up, but the reinforced wood smashed through it, sending jagged splinters of wood through Ruby's hand. Ben barked out a laugh. Not so tough without your aura now, or you. They all jumped her at once, ripping their paddles into her. Ruby weaved and dodged, trying to make sure that the paddles didn't hit her muscles and paralyze her movement. The paddles tore holes into her stomach and chest, the attackers aiming for her vitals. Although she felt more pain than she should have, she was still able to suppress it, reaching out and letting her hand be hooked onto a paddle. She gripped it and tore it out of the Amazon's hand, the woman giving out a cry of surprise. Reversing the paddle, she brought up as much aura as she could, swinging the weapon back at her. The woman raised her arm in a futile attempt to block, Ruby's blow breaking her arm in two and continuing its trajectory, smashing into the side of her head and scattering her brains onto the bare faunus next to her. Ruby was focusing completely on offense now, concentrating her aura in her strength and ignoring her defense. The bare faunus reared back, startled by the gray fluid that had splattered all over him. Taking advantage of this momentary distraction, Ruby aimed for his hand, sinking the hooks into it and ripping his hand off, making his amputated hand fly away with the paddle still gripped in it, white tendons and red muscles trailing from his exposed wrist bones. He stumbled back, reaching for his hand, but Ruby ducked another swing and followed him, inserting the hooks into his chest and ripping the paddle back out, pieces of his lungs and twitching heart flying everywhere. Ruby saw the next blow but couldn't dodge it, as she was still trying to dislodge the edge of her paddle from the bare faunus ribcage. Although managing to avoid letting the paddle hit her eyes, she still caught it on her jaw, the hooks cracking through her teeth and digging into her bone. Ben followed through with the motion, partially ripping out her jaw and opening up the soft underside of her mouth, blood beginning to spurt out. Ben let out a surprised oomph as Ruby ignored her injury and rammed herself into him, taking him by surprise and feeling his ribs crack. Even as Ben's body flew back, Ruby spun and threw her paddle at the last two men, her paddle catching onto one man's long hair and hooking into the side of his skull, ripping out a piece of bone and skin with the hair still attached, leaving him convulsing on the floor. Charging the last one standing, the ram faunus, she ignored the paddle that hooked into her sternum and broke her ribs, instead grabbing hold of his horns and pushing her thumbs into his eyes, bursting them, the sticky vitreous fluid leaking onto her hands even as she sank the broken and jagged teeth in her upper jaw into his neck, moving her head to the side and ripping his throat out. She stood for a few more seconds, hearing the ram's body falling to the ground next to her. She felt lightheaded as the room around her began to spin, the adrenaline fading and blood pumping from the holes in her neck and torso. Tipping to the side, she fell onto the ram's still twitching body. And then the strangest thing happened. The blood around Ruby reversed its flow, drawn to her body, going into her exposed veins and muscles and being absorbed through her skin. The metal limiters in her arms and legs glowed a brilliant blue and felt incredibly hot, her red aura beginning to coalesce faintly around her. Ruby felt her bleeding stop, watching in fascination as her muscles knit themselves back together and the skin healed over them before her eyes, the holes created by the hooks reduced faint white scars. Ruby spat out broken shards of her teeth as she felt her jaw reattach, running her tongue over the newer, pointier set of teeth growing in. Feeling less lightheaded and able to stand up now, she got to her feet, shreds of her clothing left behind in the puddles of dried blood on the ground. Looking around, she noticed that the surrounding prisoners had formed a ring around Ruby, gawking at her as she took down her attackers and healed back up. Ben was propped up on his elbows, still coughing a bit as he stared at Ruby. Looking down, Ruby noticed that she was nearly completely exposed, the paddles having torn away much of her clothing. She frowned a little and moved forward, intent on ending his life. Ben's eyes widened as he watched Ruby stalk towards him, scuttling backwards as he tried to get away from her. Ruby couldn't let him lose her in the crowd, so she closed the distance in one step and grabbed his neck, preparing to tear his head off. Ruby rose. I order you to freeze. A warden bellowed. He had pulled out an extending javelin, an aqua green glow surrounding it, aiming it at her head. She ignored him, then beginning to scream as she started pulling. The javelin slammed into the side of her head and passed out of the other side, leaving a bloody crater in her skull. Like a puppet with its strings cut, Ruby collapsed, letting go of Ben and falling onto him. Ben pushed her body off of him and dragged himself away from her, getting up on his hands and knees and preparing to flee. Ben pushed her body off of him and dragged himself away from her, getting up on his hands and knees and preparing to flee. Benjamin Lee, stay where you are. The warden bellowed again, bringing out another javelin. Ben froze, not daring to move after seeing what had happened to Ruby. After the javelin had entered her head, Ruby's vision had flickered out for a brief second, her aura and soul losing its hold on her body as her brain's neural pattern was disrupted, the displaced aura forcing her body to reroute the connections in her brain to restore her consciousness. Ow, Ruby said, beginning to stand up again, the hole in her head slowly beginning to heal over. The startled warden reflexively threw his spear again. Ruby twitched and the spear missed her head and hit her shoulder, going halfway through and then getting stuck. Will you stop that? Ruby said, annoyed. She pulled the spear out and flung it onto the ground. It sort of hurts, she complained, glaring at him. The warden recovered and pulled out 2 sets of handcuffs, motioning for the other wardens to step forward. Handcuff Benjamin and escort him to solitary confinement. He initiated this fight and I want to know why. Throwing a pair of handcuffs to Ruby, he nodded at her. Please put these handcuffs on. You are not in any trouble, but to ensure the administrator's safety when we bring you to the administration office we need you to be restrained. Ruby thought for a second and put them on, deciding that she believed them. All right, let's go, she said. Ruby kicked her legs against the chair as she sat in the administration office's reception room, the woman behind the desk ignoring her. 4 wardens surrounded Ruby, watching her closely and making sure she made no sudden movements. Ruby was still basically nude, the scraps of clothing still wrapped around her legs the only things covering her. She ran her tongue lightly across her teeth, small cuts forming despite slight pressure being applied. The shape of her teeth hadn't changed much, but the edges of each tooth were like razors. Ruby grinned to herself in pleasure, making the wardens who had been watching her look away briefly, creeped out by the gleaming white teeth that looked a little too sharp. The sound of dress shoes came from the hallway. The administrator stepped out, taking a second to glance at Ruby's appearance. Wardens, you can take her handcuffs off. Ruby, let's go talk in my office. The wardens began to protest, but the administrator silenced them with a look. I've already read the reports from one of the wardens, I know what she's done. Do not question me again. The wardens fell silent, acquiescing and unlocking Ruby's handcuffs. The pieces of metal fell away with a clink, and Ruby got up, following the administrator to his office. Closing the door behind her, he motioned to the chair in front of his desk, wanting her to sit down. Do you need a change of clothing before we start talking? He asked, noticing her bare chest. I'm fine, Ruby said, staring at him and enjoying his good looks. The close proximity of the administrator reminded her of his handsome appearance, making her feel more than a little bothered. The administrator looked amused, clearly realizing what was going on. Sitting down at his desk, he began talking. First things first, Ruby. Are the metal pieces in your arms and legs working? Ruby nodded. You know, I wouldn't mind if you just bent me over the desk end. She bit her lip, giving a little sound of pleasure. Control yourself, Ruby, the administrator said, smiling. I'll let you off this time, seeing that your bloodbath, pardon the pun, has made you a little too excited. Besides, he added, there's also the pesky little thing called the no interference policy. Ruby sighed a little, looking disappointed. So, what did you want to talk to me about? I wanted to ask you if those people had some sort of feud with you, the administrator explained. It makes no sense for them to have attacked you without provocation. Well, I guess I killed Ben's friend. His name was, Denton, she said, thinking. I don't think I've ever seen the other 4 people. The administrator puzzled. Oh, Ruby said, having thought of something. They mentioned that if they killed me, they would have their sentences reduced by a year. And, I also saw someone talk to one of the wardens through his tablet and tell him to leave the area, right before they attacked me. The administrator's face had frozen, his blue eyes staring into hers. Are you sure about this, Ruby? A little taken back by his response, she nodded. Completely sure. Thank you for this information, Ruby, he said. It seems we have a rat in our system. He paused, holding out his hand. I'm glad you survived, Ruby. Incidences like yours should not be occurring in our camp. No problem, Ruby said, shaking his hand. It was my pleasure. No doubt about it, Ruby, he said, chuckling. I am sure it was. Chapter 18, Death Stalkers. And then, earlier this morning, the wardens took me off the Borbatusk team. Something about the other people on the team being nervous around me. Ruby took another bite of her apple. Maximilian and Lily looked worried. So now you're on the Death Stalker team? Lily asked. Yup, Ruby said, her mouth full of food. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Ruby ate her breakfast. It was the day of the hunt, and the hunters had been woken up early, the wardens telling them to eat breakfast quickly and convene at the armory. The couple had joined Ruby during her meal, hoping to talk to her before she left for the hunt. I know you're pretty strong and all, Maximilian said, but I don't think that even you can recover from being crushed into paste. Ruby shrugged. I feel pretty good right now, I don't think the Death Stalker will be able to catch me. Lily shook her head. We aren't worried about your fighting abilities, Ruby, we're worried about the attack the other day. What if someone, I don't know, chops off your leg when you're not looking? Stabs you in the back. And then you fall down and the Death Stalker's legs come down and splat, there goes Ruby. I'll be fine, guys, don't worry so much, Ruby said, finishing the last few crumbs of her bread. I'll be really careful, okay? Lily puffed out a breath of air. I still don't feel too good about this. I wish we could go with you, said Maximilian. Geez guys, stop it, you're starting to sound like my pair. Ruby stopped, her throat closing up. Really worried people, she finished lamely. A strange expression was on Lily's face as she leaned over and gave her a hug, tousling her hair. Maximilian joined in, giving Ruby an odd sense of comfort as she hugged them back, enjoying their company while she could. So, we can't come with you, but we can give you a few tips, Maximilian said. That would be great, Ruby said, smiling. After the 20 minutes allotted for breakfast, the wardens had called the prisoners to the armory, handing off Borbatusk paddles to the Borbatusk team and then allowing the Death Stalker team to equip themselves. The people who came to camp with their own weapons were allowed to use them, with the stipulation that the weapons were to be returned upon finishing the mission. The wardens made sure the prisoners understood that if they caused trouble with their weapons, they'd be sent out unarmed for the next hunt. Ruby was positively jittering with excitement, looking forwards to the 1 hour the wardens had given the prisoners so that they could practice with their weapons in the training grounds. Standing in line, she waited for her weapon, eager to see it again. A few minutes later, she finally got it back, along with 3 clips of standard rifle dust ammo. Ruby pulled open the clips, taking out the cartridges and slotting them into her own weapon's ammo clip. She asked for and received a ragged ammo belt she repurposed as a bandolier, inserting her extra rounds into it and slinging it over her shoulder. The weapon looked just like it had been the last time she had seen it, the metal surface covered with a thin layer of dust but otherwise unharmed. Ruby stroked it, murmuring to it and cleaning off the flakes of blood stuck to the outside. She held it up and unfolded the scythe, receiving admiring glances from the nearby prisoners. Ruby cleaned the blood off of the scythe's blade, polishing it until it gleamed. Standing up, she headed to the training grounds. Upon arriving, she went to the section with the target stands, allowing herself to fire half of her clip, 15 shots, to make sure the weapon was functional. 15 bullet holes appeared in the center of 15 targets, Ruby feeling as though her weapon had never left her side. Releasing her clip and reloading the bullets she had used, she heard clapping from behind her. Maximilian and Lily stood there, smiling and applauding after seeing her performance. Ruby bounced over to them, glad that they were there. Don't you guys have lessons or anything? Ruby asked. Nah, Lily said, they gave up on our cabin of people after our crazy roommates went berserk during a lesson and repeatedly ran into the shields. I think they broke a couple of bones, so the wardens just stopped sending us altogether, telling us that we were too disruptive. So we just mostly talk to people and play cards when we're not at the training grounds, Maximilian said. I know you're going to be leaving soon, so don't let us distract you. Ruby thought for a moment. Want to practice? I'll try not to use the blade of my scythe, she teased. Definitely, Maximilian said, grinning. Let's see what you've got. After another round of warnings and farewells, Ruby left the two and gone to the main gate, where 1,000 prisoners were gathered, preparing to leave for the Deathstalker nest. 100 or so wardens accompanied them, ready to punish any prisoner that tried to stay away from the fighting. They ran for 5 miles, most of the prisoners able to keep the pace and the lagging ones constantly being shoved onward by the wardens. The landscape around them was dry and dusty, the loose soil barely able to support small shrubs. Ruby thought she saw a few small animals, heads popping back into their burrows. After an hour they had reached the cave, the sun still low in the sky, the day still early. The cave had one central opening, leading into a rocky hill. Smaller openings peppered the other sides of the hill, each barely large enough for a man to fit through. The burrow is mostly underground, separated into tunnels and caverns, the warden said. He opened up the sack he had in his hand and pulled out a white object, glinting in the sunlight. Put these markers down to map out where you go. This will prevent you from getting lost. The wardens moved through the crowd of people, handing out bags at random. Ruby didn't want to bother with it, so she handed her bag off to someone else. There are no more instructions. Your job is to clear out the caves. Go. The prisoners cautiously stepped into the cave opening, holding out the glowing white markers in front of themselves like flashlights. The wardens followed them, making sure that no one tried to run away. The first few caves were empty, but the smaller caves were filled with moderately large Deathstalkers, each about 6 feet long with claws the size of an arm. The combined strength of the prisoners cleared them out quickly, ganging up on the lone Deathstalkers and using their numerical advantage. There were a few entrances in the ground, some prisoners slipping down into them and needing help to crawl out. A few prisoners almost fell down deep abysses, teetering on the edges as their handheld lights barely warned them in time so they could stop themselves. The auxiliary caves were cleared, and the prisoners were making good time, having explored a large portion of the nest already. The first signs of trouble were the rumbling noises, the walls and floors shaking a bit as a large mass crawled up the side of one of the abysses. Some of the prisoners looked nervous, but the wardens egged them on, poking them with spears or javelins when they backed up a little too far. An extraordinarily large Deathstalker, awoken by the sounds of fighting above it, appeared over the edge, its huge claws gripping the floor and pulling itself up. Its stinger glowed orange, the light illuminating its surroundings. About 60 feet long and carrying thousands of miniature Deathstalkers, it was incredibly intimidating, the contrast of its white armor with red stripes and its gleaming black carapace giving it a frightful appearance. Some of the prisoners whimpered, and even a few of the wardens looked awestruck. The writhing mass of baby Deathstalkers in its back swept down, swamping the prisoners, even as the mother Deathstalker scuttled forwards, each step shaking the floor of the cave. Ruby swung her scythe in arcs around her, cleaving the squirming carpet of baby Grimm, twitching limbs and bodies flying everywhere. Running up the side of the cave, she landed on a small outcropping, flipping her scythe to shotgun mode and aiming at the eyes of the giant Grimm. She concentrated her shots onto one eye, each shot adding a little crack and enraging the Grimm. The other prisoners followed her lead, raising their own projectile weapons and aiming for the relatively soft eyes of the Deathstalker. The hail of dust bullets, arrows, and stones smashed against its eyes, rupturing a few and making it throw up its claws defensively. The baby Grimm had mostly been cleared away now, a few prisoners stomping here and there to end the struggling of a one or two that had been overlooked. Seeing that the large Grimm had stopped attacking, the prisoners moved forward as one, yelling and shouting and jumping onto the Deathstalker. A few were thrown off by its claws and tail, but the mass of living flesh was too great, weighing the Deathstalker down and making its joints buckle. Its carapace couldn't withstand the attack much longer, some attackers managing to find unprotected spaces in its armor and slamming their weapons into them, cutting into the soft areas. RWBY only stood near them, heeding Maximilian and Lily's warnings and being content to let the other prisoners do the work. The Death Stalker began to panic, skittering in a frenzy and moving back towards the abyss. The prisoners began to shout, many of them abandoning their weapons and jumping back down. RWBY stepped forward, wondering if she could kill it before it got away. A few of the braver prisoners followed it to the edge of the abyss, peering down and watching it scuttle off. RWBY joined them, wondering what the wardens would say about this. Suddenly, RWBY felt many pairs of hands pushing her, shoving her forward. Caught by surprise, RWBY lost her footing and fell downwards, the blackness rising up to surround her. Twisting in mid-air, she looked back up, seeing a couple of prisoners staring slack-jawed at her. She quickly lost sight of them, gathering speed as she continued to fall. RWBY braced her shotgun against herself, firing rapidly downwards as she tried to slow herself down. She ran out of ammo quickly, having fired most of her rounds at the Grim. The only thing she could do was flip herself feet down, trying to take the damage in her lower body. She spread out her shirt, trying to gain more air resistance. 5 seconds later, she hit the ground at 90 miles per hour. Her feet hit first, the bones in her foot shattering as they slammed into the stone floor. The shin bones slammed into her feet, further pulverizing them. Her upper leg bones collided with her lower leg bones at the knees, both legs shattering and splintering, the fragments jutting out of her skin. The impact traveled up her leg, slamming her hip bone into her pelvis and cracking it open. Her hips continued forwards, moving upwards and ripping through her intestines, where they finally stopped. The head continued forward, her momentum bending her upper body downwards and bending her in half, her spine snapping at the waist, her forehead nearly touching her feet. RWBY's entire body crumpled inwards, collapsing to the ground, her lower half destroyed. Head slamming into the ground, RWBY felt no pain, having already gone unconscious after the concussive force had traveled up her legs and slammed her brain into the top of her skull. Meanwhile, her scythe had hit the ground at 30 miles per hour, bouncing a few times and suffering no visible damage. Her body lay there, trying to pull itself together. RWBY blinked and moaned, her head feeling a little dizzy as she healed from the concussion. Experimentally trying to move her lower body, she found that her legs twitched a little. Her skin had already healed up, the bone fragments sinking back through her pants and into her skin, but muscles underneath writhed and coiled as they reattached, the bones moving back to their proper locations and reconnecting to the tendons and muscles. Her hip bones had already slid back out of her intestines, her pelvis beginning to realign and mend. Rumbling noises, along with a clacking in front of her, alerted RWBY to the presence of a Death Stalker. A yellow light appeared in front of her, the weakened glow from its stinger barely outlining the shape of the injured creature. The Death Stalker was bleeding from multiple wounds across its body, gashes ripped open along the edges of its bone-white armor. It had only 2 eyes left, the 2 red orbs swiveling as it searched for her. RWBY stayed quiet, trying to force herself to heal faster. However, she was given away by the sound of her hip joint popping back into place, the pop sound reverberating against the wall behind her. The scuttling noises increased in frequency as the Death Stalker turned in circles, driven into frenzy by the knowledge that something was there. As her other hip bone popped back into place, RWBY crawled forward and grabbed her scythe, using it to prop herself up, feeling the bones shift in her legs. She felt her leg bones begin cracking again, having put too much pressure on them before they were able to heal completely. A claw suddenly sideswiped her, knocking RWBY off of her feet. RWBY went flying through the air, landing and bruising a few ribs. The next time the claw came at her, RWBY rolled to the side and swung her scythe, hooking her blade into a soft joint in its claw and following it back to the Death Stalker. The moment the Death Stalker came into view, RWBY jumped, pushing off the claw with her scythe and leaping at its head area. Startled, the Death Stalker moved backwards a bit, waving its claws aimlessly. Flipping the scythe in her grip, she shifted the blade of the short end of her scythe outwards a bit, then swung it down, embedding it in one of the previously existing gashes in its head. Red liquid squirted anew from the freshly opened wound, a bit splattering onto RWBY as she ripped the blade out, enlarging and deepening the bloody hole. The bits of blood that hit her immediately sunk into her skin, the metal in her arms and legs beginning to glow again. Ruby felt exhilarated, the blood giving her some sort of high. Raising her arm again and again, she gouged deeper and deeper, her arms becoming a blur as each downward blow shattered the edges of the armor around the injury, fragments of the white plate flying upwards and around her. After dodging countless blows as the Death Stalker tried to throw her off, Ruby had carved a hole larger than she could fit through. A bit of yellow-white color appeared at the bottom of the hole as the Death Walker heaved and its flesh shifted. Taking aim, she slammed her side into the pale blob of flesh, her weapon nearly flying out of her grip due to the blood smeared around the handle. The Death Stalker jerked, twitching more than usual, one of its claws going limp. Clearly having hit something important, Ruby slammed her side into it again. The Death Stalker's legs collapsed under it, its body hitting the floor with a resounding boom. Ruby got up, feeling invigorated and alive, her fingers and feet shifting and twitching as she wondered what she was going to do. Looking up, she searched for any sign of light, hoping that some prisoners had left markers at the cliff edge. She saw nothing, the gloom swallowing up all the light from above. Going back to the Death Stalker corpse, lit with a fading yellow light, she sliced off its stinger, setting it on the ground. Aiming carefully and cutting a few trenches into the tough skin surrounding the light source, the stinger was greatly reduced in size and glowed a bit more brightly, like a demented jack-o'-lantern. Ripping off the bottom half of her shirt, she created a sling, wrapping it around her shoulder and carrying the chunk of flesh against her body. With the pale yellow light brightening her way, she slammed her side into the cliff wall, beginning her climb. Each time she embedded her side into the cliff face, she grabbed the resulting gouge and pulled herself, repeating the process until it became quick and efficient, making her way up in practiced swings. The Death Stalker blood spurring her on, Ruby continued to climb, wondering how long she had been down there for. She woke up not knowing where she was, when she was, what she was, why she was. The face she saw was impossibly beautiful and perfect, like an angel come down from the heavens. The hair was white as snow, soft and cold and pure. "Were you awake?" she hears, the voice sounding like the one she had heard in her dreams, the dreams she could not remember, the voice that called her out of the darkness. "You're beautiful," she whispered, reaching up with her fingers to touch the pale skin. A faint blush stole over her angel's face. "I'm glad you're awake," the angel said. "Do you know who you are?" "No," she whispered, a faint tugging at her heartstrings. "Don't worry, I'll help you, I'll guide you." "Good," she said, feeling the worries fall away, feeling happy. "I want to be with you forever. My love."